This is disc number 4.
Chapter 18. Paula continued working at the Children's Hospital in spite of her pregnancy, something which irritated colleagues who felt that as a married woman with a husband earning enough money to keep her in what was then deemed as the appropriate manner, she should have been at home. Even Dr. Stamm had asked her whether, given her condition, she wanted to carry on working with seriously ill children. He added that any maternal infection could eventually have a serious impact on the unborn child. Paula assured him that she wanted to have a full year of professional practice at the hospital to look back on, and would work until the end of May, seeing as her due date wasn't until August. Dr. Stamm agreed, but from then on Paula was no longer responsible for the isolation ward. In spite of the economic problems that continued to dominate at the national level, the early months of 1932 went well for Richard and Paula. Her pregnancy ran smoothly, and Richard was officially awarded his status as a consultant in psychiatry. Then, when Dr. Morgenstern retired in April 1932, Richard and Dr. Kruger found themselves in competition for the post, and to Richard's delight, he won. "You see," he said to Paula on the evening after his success, "I'm well on the road to keeping my promise to you. This is the next step towards becoming lead consultant, and by the time I get there, our child will be much older, and you'll be able to find your dream job. Will you just stop and let me say how incredibly proud I am of you?" "Absolutely. That's just what I want to hear. So?" "I am incredibly proud of you, Mr. Consultant." As Richard held Paula close and gently stroked her rounded belly, he noticed an open envelope on the sideboard. "Who's writing to us from Berlin? Oh, I'd forgotten about that." She broke away from his embrace and picked up the letter. "You remember People's Welfare, the charity we give 10 marks a month to?" Richard nodded. "They've written to say they are now a registered association under new trustees. They've already sent us new membership cards and we don't need to do anything else. Here, see for yourself." She took the 2 membership cards out of the envelope. Richard took the bright red pass with his name on it. The Gothic lettering at the top proclaimed NS Volkswohlfahrt, National Socialist People's Welfare. Beneath that was Richard's name, his date of birth, and his address. Further down were 2 boxes waiting to be filled in. One headed NSDAP membership number, the other headed NSDAP entry date. The card was stamped with the swastika used by the NSDAP. "So, the NSDAP has taken over People's Welfare?" Paula nodded. "I'm not sure what we should do. I assume they expect us to continue to support it no matter who the trustees are." "You're right, that's exactly what they expect. But we signed up with them precisely because they weren't answerable to any party political thinking. Otherwise, we would have just donated to workers' welfare. This makes a nonsense of the fundamental principle. My fundamental principle is to support struggling families so they can get health care and good information about how to control infectious diseases like diphtheria," Paula shot back. "What's Leonie saying about it? Has she been sent a membership card like this?" "I don't know. I only found the envelope when I got home." "Perhaps you should ask her." Richard gestured towards the telephone. "I can't imagine Leonie keeping any membership that's suggestive of joining the NSDAP. They have a nerve leaving a space here where you're supposed to write in your party membership number." "No need to get so worked up about it. I'm not mad on the idea either, but I ask myself whether it's right to discount them simply because one doesn't agree with every item on their list of objectives." "Not every item?" Richard snorted with rage. "Which particular item do you agree with the Nazis about?" "Okay, then. The idea of people's welfare." "What else?" Richard said, probing further and clearly furious. "What else precisely do you agree with the Nazis about?" "What's the matter with you, Richard?" "I only want to know what you think. Do you also believe that we need safe streets again and that we need more jobs to stop the people suffering? That our people must be great again and need a voice on the world stage?" "Yes, I do," replied Paula angrily, "but that doesn't make me a Nazi. Of course I'd like to be able to walk the streets alone at night again. Of course I'd like to see the back of this economic crisis, people finding work again, and all those little ghost shops reopened and full of life. Who doesn't want all that? Or perhaps you don't. I don't want anything with the swastika on it in my home, Richard shouted, and I will not pay into an organization that supports the NSDAP. And exactly why are you shouting at me? Because you're seriously considering staying in this Nazi organization. Yes, I'm considering it, Richard. It's not a crime to consider something. It just demonstrates a bit of intelligence. Starting to bellow whenever you see a swastika is just primitive. You'll be beating your chest like a gorilla next. You know what? Fine. Richard's voice had dropped, but his anger hadn't. You just carry on considering it. I'm off for a stroll around the jungle so that your deliberations are not interrupted by my primitive behavior. He picked up his coat and left. Paula took some deep breaths. In many ways, she shared his opinion, but she was angry that he wasn't prepared to break down the issues a bit first. Did they really have to give up everything that, as far as Richard was concerned, had the wrong political leaning? She phoned Leonie to see what she thought about it. Oh, they've sent you a new card straight away, have they? Leonie sounded amazed. My father and I have just been sent a letter, that's all, saying that the Old People's Welfare has been dissolved following new trustees taking over, and that all existing memberships are terminated. Didn't they say anything more than that? Paula was puzzled. No, but I think my father's first name is a bigger giveaway than our surname. Do you really think that an organization like the NSDAP wants a Dr. Isaac Hirschthal on its books? Anyway, the feeling is mutual. If the Nazis have appropriated people's welfare, that's no place for me. Nor for us. I'm going straight to the typewriter to confirm our resignation. Leonie, thank you. When Richard came back a couple of hours later, he reeked of beer. Nice that you're back. Were you drinking alone or did you meet up with Fritz? Richard looked at her guardedly. So what's the outcome of your deliberations? This. See if you could put your signature to it. She handed him the letter she'd just typed. Richard read it. Sir, we joined People's Welfare in May 1931 because we welcomed the idea of an independent, universal welfare organization supported by donation and separate from politically motivated welfare movements. With the party political takeover of People's Welfare by the NSDAP, we believe our independent interests are no longer sufficiently represented, and for this reason are informing you of our withdrawal. Enclosed are the cancelled membership cards. Yours, etc., Dr. Richard Helmer and Dr. Paula Helmer, née Engelhardt. The 2 membership cards were torn in half. I apologize for flying off the handle like that, said Richard rather meekly after he had read the letter. Don't worry about it, said Paula, putting her arms around his neck. I just reminded myself that expectant fathers can be moody too. He managed a laugh. You're a cheeky one today. I'm allowed to be. In fact, it's the basic right of all pregnant women to be cheeky. But she became serious again as she told him about her phone call with Leonie. Do you think they're deliberately filtering out Jews? She asked him. Yes, that's exactly what I think. I just wonder where it's all going to end. I'm dreading the elections in the summer. Do you really think it could get any worse? Surely we've hit rock bottom and we'll start to see signs of new hope and peace to warm people's hearts. I'd like our baby to be born into a world at peace. We'll do that for him, whatever else is going on, Richard promised her, and Paula knew he meant it. Chapter 19. Richard's new position meant his work as consultant shifted into a new direction. Of course, he continued to be devoted to his patients and always tried to establish a rapport with even the most obstinate of individuals, but most of his time was now taken up with the preparation of expert statements. This was usually related to the continuity of invalidity pension payments. Wartime veterans whose mental health had been damaged as a result of their experiences in combat had to demonstrate at regular intervals that they still fulfilled the conditions for receipt of their pension. During the course of this work, Richard had noticed how a new system of patient appraisal was gradually coming into use among psychiatrists, a system based on the beliefs of Professor Alfred Hoch of Freiburg. Very few expert witnesses dared ever to contradict the famous and respected academic, something which infuriated Richard. particularly as each time he heard the name he couldn't help thinking of approving the destruction of life unworthy of life. In Hoch's opinion, a war pension should be granted only to those whose mental illness could be directly related to a brain injury suffered in the war. All other psychological illnesses were not seen by the Freiburg professor as causally related to wartime trauma. Rather, they were caused by a weak psychological disposition, and any connection to military experience in the field was purely coincidental. In evidence, he cited many men who had withstood similar experiences without lasting damage. Therefore, he stated, due to their inferior constitution, they could not be equated with true disabled war veterans and had no entitlement to the state services provided for those other veterans. Each time Richard found this argument in an expert statement, he would channel his professional passion into the most skillful counter-argument he could muster. It wasn't long before he had earned a reputation for developing hard-nosed, caustic points of opposition that were used in many controversial cases. One day in June 1932, he found himself working on the case of one of their long-term patients who had lived for many years in one of the open houses and was able to carry out simple jobs on the land. The man had literally been buried alive in the trenches after a grenade went off and was the only one of his group to survive. He had endured hours buried among his comrades' shredded remains before he was found. While buried, he had developed some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, hearing the voices of God and the devil, and believing himself chosen by a higher power for special deeds. At first, people blamed it on the shock, but his behavior became increasingly erratic, and he was eventually diagnosed as schizophrenic. Sometimes he lost all control and thought he was being buried alive again and needed to escape. At these times, he would start screaming and was prone to attack anyone who stood in his way. The tragedy was that the man had a wife and 2 daughters. At the time of his experience in the trenches, the younger child had been a babe in arms, and the elder one had just turned 3. Given the severity of her husband's illness and the demands of her young family, the wife had struggled to cope, and her only possible course of action had been to have him admitted to special residential accommodation. His health meant that he could no longer provide for his family, so the invalidity pension was their sole source of income. But now a notification had come from his pension office claiming that a new appraisal of his case, based on the examination of records, had shown there was no connection between his mental illness and his traumatic wartime experiences. Not only were his pension payments to be stopped, but the 6 months already received had to be repaid. When the man's wife, weeping and in despair, had appeared in Richard's office, he had promised her he would do everything in his power to help with her claim. He was working on his statement, pondering his choice of words for his final assessment when his telephone rang. "Helmer here." "And here." It was Paula's voice. "I just had to phone you. Have you got a minute?" "Of course, but what's up?" "I went to Dr. Torgau this morning, and he said there's no doubt." She paused for dramatic effect. "We're having twins." He could feel 2 little heads. Richard took a sharp intake of breath. "Twins? Are you serious?" "I am. I wouldn't joke about something like this." She gave a laugh of delight. "Now we've just got to wait and see if they get in the right position for the birth, but Dr. Torgau is confident that everything will be all right." "What if they don't turn?" As soon as he'd asked the question, he kicked himself because he didn't want to worry Paula. But the very word twins reminded him of all the stories of difficult births and risks to the mother, of infants dismembered inside their mother, of emergency cesareans and complications ending in death. He tried to shake off all such thoughts, but the images persisted. "Of course they'll turn properly," said Paula happily, her buoyant mood clear from her voice. She didn't seem worried at all, although she also seemed to have read his thoughts. "And if they don't, we can rely on Finkenau. After all, they've got a modern operating theater, and a cesarean using a Pfannenstiel incision carries no greater risk than a spontaneous delivery." "I don't know whether to be happy or concerned," Richard admitted. "A cesarean always carries a risk. Complication rates at Finkenau are below 5% at the moment." "Did you know all that before, or have you just asked today?" "I did a lot of research on this for my doctorate because postpartum infection rates were significantly lower for mothers who'd had a cesarean. I was even present in the operating theater when twins were delivered by section. Richard, it's straightforward. The babies come into the world in about 15 minutes. What took the time was the stitching afterwards. The uterus, abdominal fascia, and the skin. That took the doctors around half an hour. So if you include setting up and giving the anesthetic, you can assume 1 hour at most for a cesarean. And since people have opted for the Pfannenstiel method, the mother is not left with a huge scar. I was very impressed when I saw this young mother's scar after 7 days, only a thin red line, almost hidden by the fold in her belly. I see. Come on, you should be celebrating our efficient family planning. Why have 2 pregnancies with double the risk when you can achieve the same outcome in 9 months? She laughed that carefree, happy laugh again. I don't know what to say, he confessed. That's unusual for you. Please don't worry, Richard. It'll be all right, I promise. Yes. You don't sound convinced. Listen, I've bought cinema tickets to celebrate. They're showing No Money Needed at the Capitol. Heinz Rühmann and Hans Moser. It starts at 8. Make sure you're home in time. Whatever my lady says. I can't wait to see you. Same here. Once he'd hung up, it took him a while to concentrate on his work again. Paula's confidence helped him banish the horrific images of complications during the birth, and he resolved to look forward to the twins with the same unreserved joy he'd sensed in her. Then he turned his attention to the expert opinion statement once more, as the words for the final assessment had now come to him. Even if another influence on the patient's mental health condition cannot be fully ruled out, the effects of wartime damage presented in this case are irrefutable. As a result of a grenade attack, the patient was buried alive amid the largely mutilated corpses of his fellow soldiers and had to wait hours for help while oxygen levels ran increasingly low. In addition to suffering severe physical injury, he also suffered psychological damage of at least equal severity, for he remained in fear of his life over a number of hours with no possibility of being able to save himself. To equate this individual's state of mortal fear with the more customary mortal fear experienced by men in the trenches in the way the first expert statement has done is inadmissible, because fighting soldiers in the trenches retain at least the prospect of self-defense and control over their actions, whereas a man buried alive is robbed of all bodily and mental means of defending himself and is restricted in all possible movement. The man who is buried alive has nothing left but to struggle for every breath until rescue arrives, and has not even the smallest possibility of taking control of his situation in the way that soldiers in a trench are still able to do. Further demonstration of the inappropriacy of comparing the two situations is the fact that the patient had previously been deployed to the front for a period of 18 months without any lasting change in his mental state. Compare this with cases of wartime neuroses, where patients struggle with significant symptoms even without the trauma of live burial, and, in the case of this patient, this speaks of a particularly strong mental constitution. It can therefore be deduced without a doubt that it is uniquely and specifically the experience of being buried alive, something which goes far beyond what any human being can endure, that became an essential influence in the onset of the illness. Even under the purely hypothetical admission that there could have been a hereditary disposition to schizophrenia, the onset of illness lies in direct correlation with the trauma of being buried alive. It remains a matter of speculation as to whether the onset of illness would have come about if the patient had not experienced trauma of this type. 6 weeks later, he heard that the pension office had accepted the argument presented in the expert statement and would continue to pay the invalidity pension. Chapter 20. During the night of August 8, 1932, Paula went into labor. When Richard drove her to Finkenau, the waters had already broken, and the first baby's head was pressing down hard in her pelvis. The cervix, however, had dilated very little and took the whole day to open further. Richard waited in vain at his desk for the call to say he was now a father. Kurt Hansen tried to distract him, but all Richard could think about were the possible complications. He knew this was because he felt so out of control and helpless, and tried to take his mind off his worries, but neither patient care nor paperwork helped. At 5, he packed up and drove over to Finkenau. He arrived around past and heard that his wife was still in the delivery room. The nurse he spoke to was brisk in response to his questions. "It's all taking its course. Honestly, you men are always so impatient." "It depends on what you think is impatient. My wife's been here for 18 hours already." "Yes, and that's how it is with twins. They need time. Now go and have a coffee or a walk and let us get on with our work." "And how's my wife?" "Well, what do you think? Having a baby's no fun. You certainly ask some stupid questions." And she walked off. For a while, Richard wandered up and down the empty corridor, but nobody brought him any information on Paula's progress. In the foyer, there was a public telephone, and not knowing what else to do, he called Fritz. "Shall I come over and keep you company?" "Would you really?" "Of course. What do you think? Now calm down and tell yourself everything's okay, because if anything was wrong with Paula or the babies, they'd have told you by now. They certainly called me about Doro, even though I was in the operating theater at the time." "Paula called you," Richard remembered. "Yes, because she happened to be there. I'm sure that Brandis would have phoned me himself otherwise, even if it was just because he wanted a nice specimen for his collection." That sent a shiver through Richard. He usually admired Fritz for the way he'd started to talk openly about his son, but today it stirred up his worries. "I'll wait for you in the foyer. Thank you for offering to come." Another 20 minutes passed with still no news, and nobody bothering to acknowledge his presence. Finally, Fritz appeared carrying a briefcase. "Brought some provisions," he said, winking at Richard. "If this lot are ignoring you, then we don't need to worry about our behavior either." He produced 2 bottles of beer from his briefcase and handed one to Richard. "So we're just going to sit here and drink beer out of the bottle? If it bothers you that much, I'll see if I can get some glasses. We wouldn't want to lower our standards." In spite of his anxiety, Richard couldn't help but laugh when Fritz really did come back with a water glass for each of them. They sat down together on the huge wooden bench in the foyer, and Fritz poured each of them a beer. As they were about to chink glasses, the grumpy nurse reappeared. "Typical man. Your wife is having the most difficult time of her life, and you sit here drinking beer. This is a hospital." "See, works every time," said Fritz. "A drop of alcohol anywhere in a hospital and a raging nurse comes running. Pleased to see you, Sister Matilda. It's a long time since we last stood at the same operating table. Dr. Ellerweg, I might have guessed." She put her hands on her hips, but instead of the torrent of anger that Richard was expecting, she laughed and Fritz joined in. Richard looked from one to the other in some confusion. "Sister Matilda and I are old acquaintances," Fritz explained. "If I said we were old friends, she'd bite my head off for being disrespectful." "Not just for that, either," Sister Matilda wagged her finger at Fritz in mock anger. It was obvious she liked Fritz. "And how's my wife?" "Come on, Sister Matilda, spit it out. You can see my friend's practically dying with worry here, and I can only keep him alive with liquid refreshment for so long." Fritz pointed at Richard's glass. "I've come to tell you that everything is all right. Congratulations, Dr. Helmer, you have 2 healthy babies, a girl and a boy. And as you might expect, your daughter was a very good girl and arrived quickly, but your rascal of a son took his time and had to be delivered by forceps. Just typical of a man." "And my wife?" "She's done very well. At the moment, she's still in the delivery room as she needed stitching afterwards. But I can show you the babies through the window of the newborn ward, provided you leave the beer here." "Can't throw it away," said Fritz. "To your twins." They chinked glasses this time and drained them. "Men." Sister Matilda shook her head as she turned to lead the way to the ward, but there was rather more warmth in her voice now that Fritz was here. "She's okay, really," whispered Fritz. "Barks worse than her bite. She was our theater sister up to about a year ago, and I always really liked working with her. But when she didn't get the promotion she wanted, she moved here to Finkenau, and I was sorry to see her go." At last they arrived at the ward, and Richard could see his children, even though there was a pane of glass between them to protect the newborns from visitors' germs. His daughter was bigger, her bright blue eyes already taking in everything, her head covered in downy fair hair. His son looked more delicate and had Richard's dark hair. The mark of the forceps still showed on his temples, and unlike his sister, he blinked only once, as if tired, then fell asleep in the arms of his nurse. "Congratulations again on 2 little smashers," Fritz said, clapping Richard warmly on the shoulder. "The little lad looks a bit battered, but that'll sort itself out." "I know." As he gazed at his 2 healthy offspring, Richard's worries started to melt away, and slowly, very slowly, a tremendous joy grew in his heart. "Have you thought about names?" "What do you think? We'd chosen a boy's name as well as a girl's back when we didn't know it was to be twins. Paula wanted Amelia for a girl and Georg for a boy, after my dear departed brother. And what if it had been 2 boys or 2 girls? Would it have been Georg and Emil, or Amelia and Georgina?" Fritz grinned and got a playful dig from Richard. "We've got exactly what we need for these 2. As he stood there with Fritz, he felt almost dizzy with happiness. He wanted to shout for joy. "What shall we do now? Another beer? I want to see Paula first." Fritz glanced up at the clock. "It's getting on for 8. I don't think they'll allow visits now." "Then see if you can charm Sister Matilda again. I'm not leaving till I've seen Paula." Fritz's sweet talk did the trick, and the new father was permitted a short visit to his wife. "I'm so proud of you," said Richard, "and I couldn't even grab you a bunch of flowers on the way." "Not to worry. The fruit takes up all the space," Paula said, smiling up at him. She looked pale, exhausted, and yet also indescribably happy and relieved. "Aren't they wonderful?" "Yes, they are," replied Richard, sitting down on the edge of the bed and taking her hands in his. "You see, everything went just fine. But to be honest, if I'd known how long it was going to go on for, I'd have had a cesarean. Anesthetic, wake up in an hour and the babies are there. And I couldn't do anything to help, my darling. Only wait. I hear you actually drank beer with Fritz, or so Sister Matilda told me. She was not amused, told me I should clip your wings a bit. Sister Matilda is a horrible sneak, and she didn't even tell you why I was drinking. Dearest Richard, there's no need to justify a thing. I can imagine what it was like. You phoned Fritz all worried, and he brought moral support in the form of beer. Exactly. Fritz is a good friend. I'd love him to be Georg's godfather. Good idea." He kissed her on the forehead. "I love you, Paula. Perhaps you could leave me now. I'm so exhausted. Then have a really good sleep to recover, my darling." Fritz was waiting for him at the door. "Okay, shall we go for another drink?" "Definitely," said Richard. Unlike Paula, he felt so lively and cheerful that he couldn't think of anything worse than spending the rest of the evening alone in the flat. Life was too good for that. Part 2. The Third Reich, 1933 to 1945. Chapter 21. In the elections on July 31, 1932, the NSDAP emerged the strongest party, with 37.3% of the vote. On November 6th, there were further elections, and once again the Nazis got the most votes, 33.1%. Richard always followed political developments with great interest, but the birth of his twins just a few days after the July elections meant that his attention was largely taken up by his young family. Amelia was thriving, already responding to her mother's voice with little babbling noises. Georg was quite different, a placid child showing only a fraction of his sister's alertness. Richard's father went so far as to praise what he called the baby boy's nerves of steel when, unlike his twin, he didn't flinch when the 2 guard dogs started barking right next to him. But this merely stirred Richard's vague feeling that something wasn't right. Paula tried to reassure him that it was normal for boys to develop less quickly than girls, that it was just more noticeable when you had one of each. Richard wanted so much to believe this and was only too willing to take the good-natured mockery of the family for being over-anxious, but it did nothing to allay his fears. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. Richard and Paula sat in the kitchen together and listened to the radio as it broadcast the NSDAP victory celebrations. Cheering crowds accompanied speeches by Adolf Hitler and his head of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. Even though the children were asleep in the nursery, the noise woke Amelia and she started to cry. Paula went through to see her and brought her to join them in the kitchen. turn down the radio a bit, would you, Richard? I'm afraid she doesn't know what the new Chancellor's speeches are about. And what about Georg? He's sleeping like an angel, quite oblivious to everything. She cradled Amelia in her arms to calm her. Your father would definitely be praising his nerves of steel again now. Richard nodded thoughtfully. And what if it's nothing to do with nerves of steel, he said after a while. Have you ever wondered whether he can hear properly? Paula stopped rocking Amelia and looked at Richard in amazement. What on earth makes you think that? As his mother, I'd have noticed. He reacts to me whenever I pick him up and talk to him in just the same way that Amelia does. He reacts to you when you pick him up, and you talk to him as you do it, of course, but are you sure he can really hear you? He's never startled by loud noises, is he? Not every child is immediately startled like that. Richard, he's quite normal, just a bit quieter than Amelia. Boys need a bit longer. You can see that from the way Amelia can already turn herself from her back to her front, but Georg can't. Have you ever noticed him showing a typical startle response? Richard wouldn't let it drop. No, she conceded after some thought. And do you consider that normal? Paula chewed her lower lip. It doesn't mean anything, Richard. He's still so little. In spite of her defensive remarks, Richard saw his own worries reflected in her. I'm going to check something, Richard said, standing up and going to the nursery. Paula followed him, Amelia in her arms. Georg was asleep. Georg! Richard called his name. No reaction. He leaned closer and shouted out his son's name again. The child slept on. What do you think of that? He asked Paula. He's a good sleeper and he knows it's you by your voice, so he's not scared. I consider that to be completely normal, all the more so when I think how difficult it can be to wake you, like father, like son. All right then, something different. Richard went into the bedroom, got their huge alarm clock and set it. A deafening ring quickly followed and Amelia started to cry. Georg slumbered on, quite undisturbed. What do you think now? That's enough to wake anybody. Paula had gone pale. I don't know. But if it's true, why hasn't it occurred to me before? I should have noticed. Richard saw guilt in Paula's eyes and held her close. I didn't notice either, he consoled her. Yes, but I'm the one with him all day. I was pleased that he's so calm and put everything else down to the fact that boys develop more slowly. I should have paid him more attention. Just then Georg stirred and made a lovely gurgling sound. Richard let go of Paula and picked up his son. Now then, little one, can you hear what Papa's saying? Georg chuckled in response. So, did he hear that? Paula asked hesitantly. She put Amelia, now calm again, back in her cradle and looked carefully at her son. I don't know. Let's get the little bell, then we can see if he reacts if you ring it behind his head. Paula went to fetch the bell while Richard continued to hold Georg and watched him carefully. Now that Georg was awake, he was looking all around, his eyes wide and attentive. But when his mother rang the little bell behind his head, he showed no reaction. It was only when Paula held the toy in front of his face and rang it again that he looked and tried to get hold of it. So, did he hear that, or is he just responding to what he sees? Paula's anxiety was now obvious. Richard placed Georg back in his cradle and picked up Amelia. Now let's try it with her, he said. Paula rang the bell behind her daughter. Amelia turned her head towards the sound. Paula's and Richard's eyes met as Amelia tried to touch the bell. So it's true, said Paula, shocked. Georg can't hear. Richard nodded. But at least we know and can do something about it. What are we supposed to do about it if he's deaf? There's no treatment. No, Richard acknowledged, but we can learn how to live with it. Perhaps he's simply hard of hearing, we don't know yet, and if he really is profoundly deaf, then we'll teach him the special sign language for deaf mutes. He took a deep breath and carried on cradling his daughter. We'll have to learn it ourselves first. Then that's what we'll do, said Richard with determination. Worse things happen. Fritz and Dorothea would have had a better time if all Gottlieb had suffered from was deafness. Richard noticed Paula discreetly wiping away a tear and felt that telltale pricking of the eyes, but wouldn't give in to it. He would not despair simply because his son couldn't hear. He would rise to the challenge. Whether Georg was deaf or not, this would not change his love for his son, or his desire to give him the best possible start in life. "I'll take Georg to Dr. Stamm tomorrow and he can check him again," said Paula. "If he confirms what we suspect, then I'll start to investigate where we can learn this sign language for deaf-mutes." "Good," said Richard, "but I don't like this term deaf-mute. We both know he can bellow just as well as any little human being, and we'll put everything into making sure he learns to speak properly so that people who can't do sign language will be able to understand him. There are plenty of deaf people who can lip-read, too. If he learns all that, well, he'll be able to live almost like anyone else." Paula was thinking, could it be because of the birth? You know, the forceps. He had the marks on his little head for a whole week afterwards. "I don't know," said Richard, "but is that important? It is how it is. We can't change anything. We can only feel hope for the future. He'll always have things harder than Amelia, but he'll battle through because we'll both do everything possible for him." "Do you know, Richard, that's exactly what I love you for the most. You're never defeated, and whatever happens, you always manage to bring out the good things, but you don't lose sight of the difficulties." "Paula, we've got 2 wonderful children. Nothing in the world's going to change that." Chapter 22. The next day, Paula set off to consult Dr. Stamm. Her old boss had known the twins since they were born, and Paula valued his experience as a pediatrician. He smiled indulgently when she related what they had done and why. "At that age, you can't be absolutely certain," he said, "and sometimes an infant doesn't respond in the way expected, and that can be due to tiredness or sheer lack of interest. After all, little Georg is doing well. If it had only been the business of the bell or Richard's voice by his cradle, I wouldn't have thought anything of it either. But that jangling alarm clock, that really should have woken him up, and now I'm asking myself if it's a direct result of his birth. My dear Frau Helmer, I have never known a case of forceps delivery causing deafness, but let me examine the little fellow." First of all, he expertly inspected Georg's acoustic canals, something which the baby tolerated with remarkable calm. "Nothing noteworthy there," he remarked. Then he checked Georg's hearing ability in much the same way Paula and Richard had done the previous evening. The result was exactly the same. Georg showed no reaction to sounds beyond his field of vision. Dr. Stamm frowned. "It's far too early for a definitive diagnosis. With most children, it first becomes noticeable at the age of 2 or 3 if they haven't started talking. I've rarely met parents who observe their children as closely as you and your husband, Frau Helmer. It's very unusual to entertain doubts like this in such a young baby. But what do you advise? Even though it's too soon for a definitive diagnosis, what are we supposed to do? Richard thinks we should learn the special sign language for deaf-mutes so that Georg can use it to communicate with the outside world." "Dear Frau Helmer, you have 2 options. Either you wait and see how he develops and hope that he suffers only from being hard of hearing, something which can improve over a few months, or you assume the worst and, as a result, seize opportunities denied to other, less vigilant parents. Most children born deaf are of average intelligence and possess the anatomical requirements for speech, but because they can't hear, they can't grasp how language and speech function, and this is why most remain dumb. However, there is some good research going on at the Institute of Phonetics in Hamburg. I'd advise you to get in touch with Alfred Scher. He teaches at the Deaf and Dumb School in Bürgerweide, and has also made a name for himself in the field of experimental phonetics. I'll give you the address." "Thank you so much." Dr. Stamm handed her a note of Scher's home address and that of the Deaf and Dumb School. "I'm very keen to hear how Georg develops, so please do keep me informed, Frau Helmer." "Of course, Dr. Stamm, sir." Paula placed Georg back in the twin pram alongside his sister, took her leave of the doctor, and set off for the Deaf and Dumb School in Bürgerweide. As she stepped outside, flakes of snow danced towards her, so she paused to put up the hood on the pram as well as her own umbrella. A thick layer of snow had covered the pavement over the last hour, making it difficult to push the pram to the tram stop. Fortunately, a young man came to her rescue when the tram arrived and helped her get the pram on board, which required considerable skill, given its width. From the outside, the deaf and dumb school at Bergevida didn't look different from any other school. When Paula got there, the children were enjoying break, and she heard them in the playground, just as high-spirited and boisterous as any other youngsters letting off steam. This sense of normality spurred her on as she hunted for the school secretary and asked if she might see Alfred Scher. She was lucky. He was there, and he had time to see her. "It's about my son," she said once in the staff room and seated opposite Scher. It was a bright and friendly room, the window ledges covered with houseplants and cacti, and the walls with framed pictures, probably the product of the school's art classes. "Dr. Stamm recommended I come to you after our appointment this morning with Georg." She indicated her son in the pram. "His twin sister has a clean bill of health, but with Georg, there's a strong suspicion he may be deaf." "How old is he?" "They'll be 6 months on February 9th. "That young, and you've observed deafness? Is there a family history?" "No, everyone in the family's always enjoyed complete health." She summarized the examination carried out by Dr. Stamm while Herr Scher listened attentively. "I've never come across a case of parents noticing deafness this early," he conceded. "That's why Dr. Stamm felt we should take this opportunity to get the best possible support for Georg, given that we already know about his condition. We want so much for him to grow up feeling normal, but on the other hand, we really don't know anything about dealing with children who are deaf or hard of hearing. My husband thinks we should learn the sign language for deaf mutes." "That's very much in dispute at the moment," explained Scher. "Some experts believe it's better to get the children used to spoken language and lip reading only. For the hard of hearing, I share that view, but profound deafness is a very different matter. You have to remember that sign language is not simply a question of translating spoken language into gestures, but an independent language with completely different grammar. We have a few pupils here with deaf-mute parents, and they've grown up with sign language alone, and now show severe grammatical shortcomings when writing anything in their mother tongue. There are two different worlds, Frau Helmer, and in the end, people have to decide whether to choose the world of the well or the world of the deaf-mute." "And what if people want to live in both?" "Then they have to learn sign language and teach it to their children too. Be warned, though, it's a protracted process and as time-consuming as learning a foreign language." "Can you recommend someone to teach us privately? We'd pay well for it." Scher nodded. "I think I know someone suitable. Katharina Felber is a young teacher here at the school and has a very unusual background. She herself enjoys complete health but has a deaf-mute mother, so she learned sign language as a child but at the same time normal voice speech. She lives in both worlds. She sounds perfect. If you'd wait just one moment, I'll see if Fräulein Felber is free. She's just been on playground duty." Scher got up and left the room. He was soon back and brought with him a young woman not long out of school herself. She had long dark hair drawn up into a bun and wore a simple blue dress with a white lace collar, which was just a little too long to be fashionable. "Frau Helmer, this is Fräulein Felber." Paula shook hands with the young woman. "I'm very pleased to meet you. Has Herr Scher already told you why I'm here? You and your husband would like to learn sign language." "That's right. I'll need to speak to my husband about timings. When would it suit you during the week?" "I can fit in with you, Frau Helmer." "Thank you. I'll phone you as soon as I've discussed it with him. Do you have a telephone?" "No, we don't. My mother's unable to use one. But you can definitely reach me through the school secretary's office." Her voice was very timid. "Then I'll get in touch here as soon as I've talked to my husband about it." Richard was very impressed when he heard that evening what Paula had already done, and was interested not only in sign language, but also in the experimental phonetics that Paula had mentioned in passing. "What's that actually about?" he asked, but Paula had to confess she hadn't asked much about that side of things. "Maybe you should ask Herr Scher more about it yourself, Richard. He came across very well, an expert, but so humane, too. I think the two of you would get on really well." "That's a good idea. I'll see if I can reach him by phone in the morning." "What day shall I say to Fräulein Felber, then?" "Tuesdays." "Tuesdays? That was quick. Anything I don't get through on Monday is out of the way by then. On a Tuesday, I can finish work promptly and do everything else later in the week." He said this with such a twinkle in his eye that Paula marveled at how swiftly they'd both come to terms with a situation that was truly tragic and which no one knew about apart from her father and Richard's family. At the same time, she refused to see Georg's deafness as a terrible stroke of fate. It had seemed that way at first, but today she'd realized how many children like him led a normal life, albeit at a specially equipped school. For a moment, she even glimpsed the benefits that can come from such a challenge because it would open her eyes to a completely new world. But she knew she couldn't say that to anyone other than Richard. Neither her father nor her parents-in-law were remotely capable of seeing it that way. Of course, they would all support Georg, but their pity and sympathy would always be paramount. So it was up to her and Richard to smooth the way ahead for Georg without pity, but with all the love and care that parents can bring. Chapter 23. The next few weeks were full of highs and lows for Richard. He tried to be strong and optimistic, and he had largely managed to allay the fears of his parents and father-in-law as he told them about all the possibilities for helping Georg develop. His mother, however, remained devastated by the news. "But he'll never be able to use a telephone or listen to the radio," she'd said. "He'll be cut off from the world." "That's nonsense," her husband said, wanting to be positive. "He can read the paper and write letters. Not many people have a telephone in any case." "Well, if those Ritters next door have already got one, you can bet that everyone else will too by the time Georg grows up." "Then that's how it is. At least he'll be able to enjoy a soak in the bath without that wretched bell disturbing him the whole time. There's always a bright side." "Hans Kurt, you're incorrigible. I just hate moaning. The boy'll make his own way in life, deaf or not." This made Richard smile and reminded him how similar he was to his father. The regular contact with Alfred Scher also helped him. In the early days of their burgeoning friendship, they had talked predominantly about speech acquisition. Scher had emphasized that it was perfectly possible for the deaf to master speech, but it was difficult for the hearing to understand them. He explained how their speech was unclear because they had no sense of how the words should sound. They could only try to imitate lip movement and create the same sounds in the larynx and pharynx. "It's hard for them to adopt the right breathing technique, too," explained Scher during their first telephone conversation. "Phonetics is a complex process, although those of us who can hear don't realize it as we have been using it since childhood. We hear what we are saying and can modify it to sound right, something that a profoundly deaf child can't do. They rely constantly on the response of their immediate environment, and we can see how important hearing is in the formation of speech when we look at someone with age-related hearing loss." "But they go on speaking quite normally," suggested Richard. "Yes, but noticeably louder. Because they themselves no longer hear so well, they speak at a volume that enables them to hear their own voice, but do that without realizing it's happening." "That's true," Richard acknowledged. "I've often noticed that, but didn't think about the link." "Yes, that's because there are so many things we don't ever consider, precisely because they're obvious to us, which can cause quite a bit of confusion. It's such an effort for hearing people to follow what a deaf person is saying that they'd rather have it all translated for them by someone else." "But can the speech be understood?" "Better in some than in others. As far as your son is concerned, I have high hopes because he is still an infant. Always demand the best of him and never allow him to get away with less than that, even if he fights against it. He'll thank you for it later because most people think that someone who can't speak clearly is backward. This impression is often reinforced by the fact that those who have grown up with only sign language know only that form of grammar, and it's quite different from that of our language. If you read a letter written by one of these people, you'll find it full of muddled and incomplete sentences. This is particularly unfortunate if writing a formal letter to one of the authorities." Scher laughed bitterly. "You can imagine how difficult it is for these people to be taken seriously." "I certainly can." Richard recalled his experience of writing expert statements for the Invalidity Pension Office. Over the next few weeks, the contact between him and Scher was strengthened by their shared political views, as well as their common interest in helping deaf children. During this period, he and Paula started their private tuition in sign language with Fräulein Felber. During the first few weeks, Katharina Felber taught them the basic signs and gestures and dispelled their reserve in expressing themselves not only with their hands, but also through mime and posture. After each lesson, Richard would feel as if he had been talking all evening, although not a single word had been said. When he described this feeling to Paula, she confided that she felt the same. "That accounts for what Herr Scher said about it really being a language in itself," she said. "We spent the whole evening talking, but not with our mouths, and yet the brain recognizes it as speech and communicates to us the feeling that this was a real conversation with words. I'm finding it fascinating. And tiring. My mother will say, 'Oh, poor Georg, he's not going to be able to talk when the light's off.'" Paula laughed at the imitation of his mother's voice. "Yes, but when the light's off, people have lots of other ways of making themselves understood," she said with her most impish smile. Tenderly, he took her face in his hands. "Do you ever have doubts, Paula? You always come across as so strong and completely at ease with this." "So do you." He let out a sigh. "Yes, because we have no choice. But there are times when I want to shout and scream and let go of all the self-control and rant on and on about how unfair it is that Georg will never be able to hear." "So why don't you?" He sighed again. "Because it wouldn't change anything and wouldn't make me feel any better." It might sound strange, but I never feel the need to do that. Somehow it's become quite normal for me that Georg is as he is. He'll never play the piano or listen to the radio or, as your mother put it, make a telephone call, but he'll be able to drive a car, go off with you to do photography and learn how to develop the pictures. He'll also be able to run, swim, do gymnastics, and will have a highly developed sense of sight with which he can enjoy his surroundings. Isn't that enough?" Of course, said Richard quietly. "And that's why I don't yell out all my despair. I don't have any right to do that. All the more so when I think of Fritz and Dorothea, who pour out all their love on the doxy. And they're happy, you know, so don't forget that." "Yes," he acknowledged, "though I reckon Fritz would be even happier if Dorothea could eventually get over her fear of another pregnancy. He'd hoped that seeing ours would give her a nudge in that direction, but Georg's deafness seems to have had the opposite effect on her. Maybe that'll change when she realizes that it doesn't matter and that maybe Georg will grow into a happy little boy. Let's hope so. I'd love that for Fritz." Chapter 24. In the first few months after the change of government, Richard's thoughts revolved largely around his son, so he didn't immediately notice the insidious changes that were taking place at the asylum. He first caught on at the weekly consultants meeting, when the senior consultant announced that their colleague, Dr. Jakob Goldner, who'd been in charge of the open country houses, had left the hospital at short notice, and that the widely respected Dr. Kruger would take over the post. "Where's Dr. Goldner gone to?" asked Richard. He'd always liked Dr. Goldner, and he'd hoped that he'd now fulfilled his dream of getting a more senior role in another mental hospital. "I don't know." The way the senior consultant spoke made it clear that he wanted no further questions, and that got Richard thinking. When a colleague moved on, there was never usually any secrecy over their new position. "Right, that concludes this item on the agenda. Let's move to the next. A new law has been passed this month, and it will have an impact on our work. It's the law for the prevention of progeny with hereditary diseases, and it allows for the sterilization of people with hereditary diseases." This news was greeted with applause. Even Richard joined in, as he had never understood why people should be prevented from having themselves sterilized if they were carriers of a hereditary disease. It had long been permitted in most other European countries and in the USA. Only in Germany had the Church vehemently opposed it. Richard vividly recalled the arguments put forward by several bishops in which they lamented the promotion of immorality through allowing those with hereditary diseases to indulge in unrestrained fornication without fear of pregnancy. The draft bill had been tabled by the previous government, and Richard had to admire the efficiency of the new government in getting it ratified in the Reichstag. "I've brought you the relevant extract." The senior consultant passed around copies of the document, still smelling strongly of alcohol from the duplicator. Law for the Prevention of Progeny with Hereditary Diseases, July 14, 1933. The government of the German Reich has passed and hereby announces the following law. Section 1. Those with hereditary disease may, by surgical intervention, be rendered infertile, sterilized, if, in accordance with medical research, there is a high probability that their progeny will suffer from severe hereditary physical or mental defects. In accordance with the purposes of this law, hereditary disease includes those who suffer from the following: innate feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, circular insanity, manic depression, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, hereditary severe physical deformity. Furthermore, those suffering from severe alcoholism may also be rendered sterile. Section 2. The request is to come from the person who wishes to be rendered sterile. Should this person be incapacitated in law, or incapacitated due to feeble-mindedness, or under the age of 18, then a legal representative is authorized to make the request. That person additionally requires authorization by the court-appointed guardian. Where an adult has a personal carer, then the carer's agreement is required. Certification from a German Reich qualified doctor is to be appended to the request to confirm that the process and consequences of sterilization have been explained to the person concerned. The request can be withdrawn. Section 3. An authorized doctor can also request the sterilization of inmates in a hospital, mental asylum, or nursing home, as can the head of a penal institution. This law comes into effect on January 1, 1934. Berlin, July 14, 1933. Chancellor of the Reich, Adolf Hitler. Minister for the Interior, Wilhelm Frick. Ministry of Justice, Dr. Franz Gürtner. Richard read it once, then a second time, and eventually spoke. I noticed that schizophrenia is cited here as a hereditary disease. Has there been some new academic research? To my knowledge, no hereditary element has ever been proven, although there can be a higher incidence in some families. The same applies to manic depression. Herr Helmer, you can safely assume that the specialists involved in drafting the new law have had as their source the most recent academic research. Our job is not to question the law after the event, but to follow it. Simultaneous to the release of this text came the call for a number of asylum heads to examine inmates in relation to the application of Section 3. The senior consultant paused briefly. Gentlemen, in the coming weeks you will receive the necessary registration forms, which must be carefully filled out with regard to each and every one of our inmates. Concentrate on those patients who are easier to treat and expect an early discharge. These have preferential status for sterilization. And if they refuse, if they have a legal advocate, their decision will hold good. Should there be no advocate, then it is our job to persuade the patient of the advantages of sterilization. And if they won't be persuaded, Richard persevered, we'll discuss that if it arises. Any other questions? Dr. Harms raised his hand. What's the definition of severe alcoholism? We don't have to deal with that. It relates purely to inmates of institutions for drinkers. There were no further questions, and so the senior consultant declared the meeting closed. Dr. Harms caught Richard at the door. You asked about Dr. Goldner earlier on. Do you really not know? What do you mean? He's a Jew. So? Asked Richard. Quite a few state hospitals and asylums have been under pressure from on high to distance themselves from all Jewish doctors. Dr. Goldner isn't the only one. An old student chum of mine, a consultant in general medicine, has just been discharged as well, but he was lucky and got a job at the Israeli hospital instead. And on what basis are Jewish doctors being dismissed? For being Jewish. But that's ridiculous. Go and look at Mein Kampf. You won't believe some of our new chancellor's ideas. I have no intention of giving these people any additional support by buying his book. You don't need to. The library here has a number of copies in stock. I know because I borrowed one of them. I'd be interested to hear what you think of it because at the moment you seem to be the only other person here, apart from me, not letting himself be infected by this insanity. Have you been in Dr. Kleinschmidt's office of late? No. He's decorated it all with party symbols, including a huge framed motto in Gothic script reading, "National Comrades, remember you're a German, Heil Hitler." He even expects his patients to say it when they greet him. Bizarre, don't you think? Dr. Kleinschmidt? You can't be serious. Just go to his office. Dr. Harms shook his head. I wish you a pleasant day, my dear colleague. Early in the afternoon, Richard went over to the institution's library to borrow a copy of Mein Kampf. He had no trouble finding one, as the library seemed to have a dozen copies on the shelves. Back in his office, he started to leaf through, looking for specific references. What is being neglected on all sides in this matter has to be made up for by the people's state. It must place race at the heart of everyday life. The people's state must make a declaration of infertility regarding anything of sickly appearance or hereditarily burdened, and thus additionally burdensome, and to assert this in practice. Speechless, Richard slammed the book shut. And to think he'd got worked up over the writings of Alfred Hoch and Karl Binding. When he got home that evening, he found Paula in the kitchen trying to console a tearful Leonie over a cup of coffee. What's happened? Richard had never seen Leonie look so distraught. Paula replied on her behalf. They've dismissed a number of Jewish doctors at the children's hospital, even Dr. Stamm. Nobody's thought about what a good doctor he is and how much he's done for the place. They've just dismissed him because he's a Jew. Leonie, too. Richard sat down at the table with them and poured himself a coffee. What are you going to do now? He asked Leonie. I'll help my father in his practice. There's not much else I can do. Leonie sighed miserably. There are rumors going around that Jewish doctors will soon no longer be approved to use the National Health Insurance Scheme. But they can't do that, raged Paula. That would mean the end for many practices and for health care itself. I don't think our government is going to care about that, commented Richard. Not after what I've experienced today. He told them about the consultants' meeting and his conversation with Harms. And what will you do if you have to fill out these forms? Paula asked him. I can't decide, he confessed. On the one hand, I think that sterilization would be a blessing for some of our patients, but I don't like the way the voluntary aspect seems to have been taken away from certain people, while in the original version of the law it was voluntary for everyone. This is not about patient welfare or avoiding the burden of unwanted parenthood. Now it's all about the absurd ideas of a totally uneducated, unenlightened, and obsessed politician like Hitler. Then there's all the nonsense he's written in his book. I just can't believe it. But it appears to be our new Bible. How else could you explain the library at work having a dozen copies in stock? So what will you do? Paula asked him again. I have no idea. Richard looked weary. You both know what a passionate advocate of birth control I am. In certain cases, sterilization is actually indicated. And if this law were approaching the issue with caution and care, it wouldn't be such a bad thing. But the radical nature of it disgusts me. Why do so many patients have to be assessed and registered? It makes no sense at all. It would be enough simply to have a conversation with them shortly before their discharge to make sure they know about the opportunities for sterilization. I don't envy you that job, said Leonie. I'd almost prefer dismissal to doing that. You can't be serious. No, conceded Leonie, not completely, but I'm trying to look on the bright side. She let out a huge sigh. Maybe my father's idea of emigrating to Switzerland isn't so crazy when I think about what's happened here in just the last 6 months. Try not to get too down about it, said Paula. It can't get any worse, surely. Richard raised his eyebrows at that. No? And what if Leonie's father loses access to the health insurance scheme? Don't say that. Do you really think the medical council would allow respected colleagues to be treated like that? I know they have no influence over state hospitals, but surely eligibility for the scheme can't suddenly be declared invalid. Why on earth not? Richard persisted. Oh, stop it. I don't want always to fear the worst like you do. Nor do I, said Leonie. And if we're desperate, there's always Switzerland. She managed a smile in spite of her despondent state. Richard said nothing more, but his sense of unease was growing. Chapter 25. When Richard found the initial pile of registration forms on his desk and saw that one of the first patients he had to assess was Herbert, he felt as though he'd been punched in the belly. This wasn't because of the case itself. He accepted that Herbert would never be able to support a family. His shock and disappointment owed more to the fact that dear, naive Herbert still dreamt of leading a normal life, in spite of his perpetual failure to get transferred to an open country house. Richard also knew that Herbert could never be talked into agreeing to sterilization, but then he started to wonder why Herbert of all people should even be considered, because he never left the secure unit and had no contact with women. He reflected for some time as to how he might best complete the form in order to protect Herbert's dignity and integrity. Eventually, he put a cross beside the statement that sterilization was not required, and gave as the reason the unlikelihood of such a seriously ill patient ever being released, given his repeated failures to be transferred to an open house, and therefore being at no risk of fathering a child. Next, he addressed the forms relating to births of the feeble-minded. This included Julius, the older Down syndrome patient who tended the cows. Why sterilize Julius? Most men with his condition were in any case infertile, and Julius had never shown any particular interest in women. Again, he marked the statement that sterilization was not indicated and gave some thought as to how he could best justify this. The simplest would be to state that Julius was infertile, although such an assertion would mean he was breaking the rules of medical conduct, as he would be quite deliberately falsifying an official document. Under certain circumstances, this could cost him his job. He took a deep breath and put Julius's form on the pile for resubmission. The next case was comparatively straightforward. The subject was a mentally deficient or feeble-minded man, already father to one illegitimate child who had inherited his father's hydrocephalus and was so deficient that he couldn't even benefit from attending a special school. In this case, sterilization would be a blessing for the patient and for the women who, for some inexplicable reason, allowed him into their beds. Richard marked the statement that sterilization was indicated on medical grounds, provided that the patient was in agreement with the explanation given him. By evening, Richard had worked through the first half of his cases and continued to avoid the pile of resubmissions, a very different approach to that of his colleague Kruger, who he encountered with his own stack of forms tucked under his arm as he made his way over to the secretariat. "Oh, did you get caught up in an emergency?" he asked Richard, giving his small batch of papers a hard look. "How can a hard-working expert like you have done so few in a day?" In my view, the wording of the questions is highly complex and has far-reaching implications. "Is it now?" Kruger said with a smile. "It's very simple, actually. Can you imagine any one of our inmates in the role of father?" "No," Richard conceded. "There you are, then. Why take so much trouble? It's a waste of time for specialists to have to give thought to this. But on the other hand, sterilization costs money and is not necessary for those who are already infertile. The way I consider a case is whether reproduction could occur." "Aha," observed Richard. "And how do you go about it?" "I scrutinize whether sterilization is necessary in each individual case. In my estimation, it's not necessary for patients whose discharge will be in the distant future because they have no contact with women. And as you yourself have said, a sterilization operation is expensive. We should consider the indications very carefully." Kruger muttered something under his breath, while Richard suddenly realized that he had hit upon the crucial solution in getting around any blanket compulsory sterilization for his patients. It was all about cost, an unbeatable argument both before and since the economic crisis. As soon as he returned to his desk, Richard phoned Fritz. He was lucky to find his friend in the office and not stuck in the operating theater, as was more usually the case when he tried to contact him. "Richard, what a pleasant distraction," Fritz greeted his friend effusively. "And perfect timing, I've got some excellent news." "Tell me." "Dorothea is pregnant. We found out yesterday, and she's so excited about the baby." "That's fantastic. I hope Rudy won't be jealous." Fritz laughed. "Never. He's as pleased as we are. Isn't it magnificent news, though? so fingers crossed that everything goes okay and we have a lovely, healthy baby. When's it due? That's the only thing that's bothering Dorothea, Fritz conceded. End of January, same as Gottlieb. But that doesn't mean anything. We're just quietly looking forward to it all. I'm really pleased for you both. How about a celebratory beer? I might run late today. I've still got 2 operations to go, but tomorrow's fine, so I'll take you up on that. Now, what can I do for you? Have you heard about this new law for the prevention of progeny with hereditary diseases? Only in passing, something about sterilization being permitted as a matter of course. Have you ever carried one out? That's been prohibited for years, so why are you asking me? So you've never carried out a male sterilization procedure? I have, even though it was prohibited. It was last year when I was at a conference in London. I got to know an English doctor, nice chap. Max Cooper had been very keen on my research publications on operative care for bullet wounds to the skull. I seem to have become rather well known in British medical circles as a result. He chuckled with pleasure at this. Maxwell is a consultant neurologist and showed me his operating theater. There happened to be a sterilization scheduled for that day, and because it's so rare here in Germany, I took up his offer of lending him a hand. Can you give me an idea of what a sterilization procedure like that costs? No idea. Why do you want to know? Richard explained. That's bad, Fritz agreed. You know how much I love surgery, but we should avoid unnecessary operations like the plague. You only need to tot up the hourly cost of the surgeon, theater nurse, and anesthetist, then add on the equipment, so I'd say around 30 marks for the operation alone. Then, with post-operative care, you're probably looking at 50 marks, and that's without complications. Richard gave a low whistle. A tidy sum, half the monthly wage of an ordinary worker. I can see how to work that into my argument. Thanks, Fritz. Shall we meet at the Green Man tomorrow, 6 o'clock? I'll be there, Fritz promised. After a consultants' meeting a fortnight later, Dr. Harms praised the argument Richard had put forward regarding the costs incurred by serial sterilization without critical analysis of need. Did you see Kruger's face? Richard smiled. When obvious resistance is useless, then we have to fall back on our own resources. Your advice about looking at Mein Kampf was worth its weight in gold. It's only by seeing what's behind their thinking that you can come up with an effective countermeasure. This was only one small triumph, but Richard relished it, because over the next few months it allowed him to stay true to his moral ideals, in spite of the difficult times in which they lived. Chapter 26. One sunny Friday afternoon in May 1934, Richard was at his desk as usual, signing letters and going through files, but his mind wasn't fully on his work. He had the next day off and was already looking forward to spending the weekend at Travemünde with Paula and the children. Fritz also had the weekend off and planned to join them together with Dorothea, their daughter Henrietta, now 4 months, as well as their doxy Rudy, who was adored by Richard and Paula's twins. Emilia could already say a few words and had learned quite a few sign language gestures, as had Georg. Fräulein Felber continued to come to their home every Tuesday to teach Richard and Paula. In addition, Paula had become good friends with Fräulein Felber's deaf and dumb mother, and often went to see her with the children to perfect her knowledge of sign language. Richard was quite relaxed about the fact that his wife had long surpassed him in that regard. As he sat thinking about the Baltic coast, there was a knock on his door. "Come in." It was Dr. Kruger. "This case landed on my desk, but I think you'd better review it as it's concerning your expert statement of 2 years back." He placed a brown folder on Richard's desk. The name on the front was Johannes Mönike. Richard remembered the case straight away. It was the man who had developed schizophrenia after being buried alive in the trenches. "Thank you," said Richard. "I'll take care of that." He expected Kruger to leave, but the man stayed where he was, in front of his desk. "Was there something else?" "I'd be very interested to know what you think of the argument put forward by this expert statement in which Dr. Brockman no longer sees this patient as meeting the eligibility criteria for continuing to draw the invalidity pension." "I shall tell you as soon as I have read the statement. Anything else?" No, not at all. May I wish you a pleasant afternoon and an enjoyable weekend, sir. And the same to you. The name Dr. Marius Brockmann didn't mean anything to him, but no sooner had Kruger left the office than Richard picked up the file. Kruger's smugness had made him fear the worst. My colleague Dr. Helmer argues in his preliminary statement that the patient has a particularly strong psychological constitution in comparison with others suffering from wartime trauma because prior to his burial alive, he had been deployed to the front without demonstrating any distinctive mental condition. Taking this fact into consideration, it cannot be concluded from a medical point of view precisely why the experience of being buried alive, without any innate disposition to the condition, should have led to the onset of schizophrenia. On the other hand, the patient was 25 years old at the time, the peak age for the early manifestation of this hereditary illness. Even under more desirable conditions, the onset of this illness could have been expected at precisely this time. Scientific literature finds no reference to a hereditary illness being brought on by war trauma. This would be medically impossible because the genes are determined at conception. The argument put forward by the writer of the preliminary statement suffers from a lack of specialist analysis of the given facts, using instead an embellished writing style to try to arouse sympathy, something more suited to light romantic fiction. Being buried alive is, of course, a traumatic event, but there are numerous examples in scientific literature which show that a man who is hereditarily sound and of pure blood can withstand this without damage. Where, however, inferior stock comes into play, then the sick genome will always prevail. From a human standpoint, it is understandable that Dr. Helmer has let himself be ruled by sympathy in writing this statement, but such sentiment should never take priority in the preparation of expert statements. An expert who allows his feelings to dominate has failed in his profession. With regard to the proven hereditary nature of the illness in this patient, as well as his previously recognized strong mental state, the onset of schizophrenia can be explained uniquely by the fact that the patient had reached the age at which the sick gene prevails. The connection with being buried alive is of a merely temporal nature. The preconditions for further payment of the invalidity pension are therefore not met.
This is the end of disc number 4. Please insert disc number 5. This is disc number 5.
Arrogant idiot, hissed Richard to himself. He took a few deep breaths. He could usually easily spot weak arguments in statements of this kind, but this one didn't read like an expert statement, more like a pamphlet in the style of Hitler's Mein Kampf. While he mulled over how to respond, a thought came to him. If schizophrenia was considered hereditary, then there had to be a transparent line to follow in Mörnike's family. However, if Mörnike was the only sufferer, there would be the opportunity to question the diagnosis and, in its place, put forward an organically conditioned psychosis with parallels to schizophrenia. Mörnike's wife had no telephone, so Richard wrote her a letter asking her to let him have a statement on any mental anomalies in her husband's family. He then placed the folder on the pile of resubmissions and resolved not to let this case spoil the weekend he'd been looking forward to so much. The drive to Travemünde was enjoyed by all, even though Paula complained loudly about Richard and Fritz repeatedly overtaking each other on the empty country road. "Slow down. You boys always want to see whose car goes faster." "What the heck, Fritz knows it's ours. He only wants to show me how well his car accelerates. We're saving ourselves for the real contest when the motorway to Lübeck's ready." "Which motorway's that, then?" "I read about it in the paper a few days ago. Work's due to start in May 1937, and the second section between Lübeck and Travemünde should come in 1938. If you really put your foot down, you could do Hamburg to Travemünde in an hour and a half." "So that's what you're both practicing for," Paula said with a sigh. "I'd still rather you didn't drive like this. It's not as if Fritz urgently needs any new patients." Richard laughed, but relented and moderated his driving to a more sedate pace. They had booked rooms at the Emperor Hotel, along with 2 beach chairs which Fritz and Richard immediately surrounded with a suitably grand wall of sand. Meanwhile, Paula collected shells with the twins while Dorothea was busy with Henrietta and Rudy. They'd smuggled their little dog onto the beach in a basket and put a towel over him whenever the beach supervisor hove into view. The sea was still very cold, but the twins splashed happily at the water's edge. Anyone looking at Amelia and Georg would never have guessed that the little boy was deaf, as he shrieked with delight just as much as she did, although he couldn't use words in the way she had started to. Baby Henrietta lay content on a woolen rug, with Rudy obligingly acting as a pillow of sorts. Richard had brought along his camera and took around 12 photos of their group, especially the children and the dog. "Times are not nearly as bad as we feared," confided Fritz, as he and Richard lingered over a beer in the hotel bar that evening. "Apart from public hospitals dismissing all our Jewish colleagues, and my patients having to battle even more repressive treatment than before, things couldn't be better," retorted Richard, barely able to conceal his bitterness. "Of course, yes, I'm really sorry about Leonie," said Fritz quietly. "Is she still working with her father?" Richard nodded. "Yes, and he's been allowed to keep his access to the health insurance system because of his status as a war veteran. Dr. Stamm's only allowed to treat private patients now." "That's absurd," Fritz said, taking a gulp of his beer. "Although one thing you have to hand to the Nazis, there is order on the streets now. I haven't had a single gunshot case in the last 6 months." "There is that, at least," said Richard, a harshly ironic edge to his voice. "All you need to add to the list now is stable prices, a fall in unemployment, and Germany having the fastest recovery in Europe from the economic crisis." "Yes, that's really something. But as for the other things, if they overdo this business with the Jews and the sick, they'll get taught a lesson at the next elections. For God's sake, Fritz, haven't you realized that the SPD and many other parties were banned last year? And then there's this new law against the founding of new parties." Fritz stared at Richard in amazement. "I didn't know that. I don't really follow politics like you do. So, if there are no other parties, why bother to vote at all? I'm wondering how more than why. A ballot paper with just NSDAP on it? And they can win with a single vote in their favor. That would be grotesque as dismissing Jewish doctors, as replacing our black, red, and gold flag with the black, white, and red German Empire one with a swastika stuck on it. And then there's this laughable Heil Hitler business being used as the national form of greeting." Fritz laughed. "And you're laughing?" Richard flushed with anger. "No, I was thinking of something else. A colleague of mine was telling me the German greeting is ideal for pub-goers. Say 3 liters as fast as you can. 3 Liter. And if you raise your right arm at the same time, it starts to sound the same as Heil Hitler. So if people don't want to do the German greeting, they just say how much beer they want." Now Richard saw the funny side. "Takes a bit to understand it. Yes, but you mustn't go muddling it up and say 3 pints by mistake. Doesn't work then. I'm having another. What about you?" 4 days later, Richard was in his office when Frau Mürnike's reply arrived. She wrote that she knew nothing of any mental illness in her husband's family, but that his grandmother had hanged herself in the attic years ago. Richard sighed. From most expert opinions, one suicide would be a clear indicator of long-standing mental illness in the family. He'd have to think of something else. But what? His mind was a blank. Eventually, he wrote, "Whether or not one agrees with the general view that schizophrenia is hereditary, something for which there is no adequate evidence, only the power of a decision made in law, there is at the present time no verified way of determining its onset in advance. Furthermore, the influence of environmental factors and the traumatic experiences at the time of the onset cannot be ruled out. The assumption made by Dr. Brockman that schizophrenia, independent from any trauma, developed in the patient's 26th year is unreliable because it deals with only a statistical average of the first manifestation. In our asylum alone, original cases have been observed between the ages of 18 and 47. Even if one assumes a genetic predisposition, it remains speculative as to when the illness would have manifested itself in favorable conditions. Taking into consideration the fact that first manifestations are regularly seen well into the 5th decade of life, In more favorable conditions, the patient would have expected 15 to 20 years of good health, during which he would have been able to support his family. Because his war trauma took this opportunity away from him, it seems only fair that the state undertake to provide an invalidity pension for a deserving war veteran and a national comrade. 6 weeks later, he heard that the payment of the invalidity pension to the family had definitively ceased. The pension authority went along with his expert statement only insofar as saying the wife need not pay back monies already received, because one could not rule out with any certainty that the schizophrenia had been prematurely triggered by trauma. Chapter 27. Hamburg, January 1936. You can't mean this. Leonie, please think it over again, both of you. Paula was on the telephone and very upset. Paula, I'm so sorry, but we've been thinking about little else for ages, I promise you. But Papa has decided, and I'm going with him. There's nothing for us here now. Paula gasped. On the one hand, she completely understood Leonie's logic. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor had now been in place for a few months and was a kick in the teeth for all Jewish citizens. Marriage between Jews and Aryans had immediately become an offense, as had sexual intercourse outside marriage, described as racial defilement and punishable by imprisonment. On top of this, Leonie's father had now lost his access to the health insurance system and therefore the majority of his patient base. Yet Paula kept hoping that things would change. She didn't want to lose her closest friend. Leonie carried on. My father's got friends in Switzerland. They're desperate for doctors. He could open a really successful practice there and I could work in a hospital, and I won't be halfway to prison if I make my own choice about who I want to be with. Leonie gave a bitter laugh. Paula, there's no other solution. We're ready to close up our home here and leave behind everything we can't take with us. Paula went cold. She just couldn't believe what was happening. And when are you leaving? Early March, but don't worry, we'll see each other lots before then. Paula swallowed hard and changed the subject before she slipped into even greater despair. You're due to come over again soon in any case. The day before yesterday, Georg said a whole sentence and it was completely intelligible. Well, intelligible to us. That's wonderful. I'm so thrilled for you. Who'd have thought he'd make such good progress? He benefits a lot from having a twin who can hear and who practices every day with him. Dr. Stamm was saying that in different times he'd have written a paper on Georg's positive development and the opportunities created for deaf children by early intervention, but given the times we live in, this would only harm Georg, and we shouldn't in any way push ourselves forward and attract attention. The longer we can conceal his deafness, the better. But there's no inherited deafness in Georg's case. That doesn't interest the Hereditary Health Court. They demand proof of no hereditary factors. And if you can't prove it, you're sterilized. It's arranged, and that's it. Did you know the government now arranges marriages between those who've been sterilized so they can remain among their own kind and not marry anyone who wants children? Leonie was speechless. That's why we don't want Georg to be noticed by the Gesundheitspolizei. That's what they're calling these so-called enforcers of racial hygiene. It'll be hard in 2 years' time when he starts school, because he can't follow the lessons in normal school, which is why we've been sending him to Bürgerweide. Richard asked a trusted colleague to produce a statement for Georg saying that he has no hereditary condition and that only the circumstances of his birth caused his hearing loss. I thought you weren't completely sure about that. You're right, we're not. But it's not about the truth, it's about protecting Georg. Have you two ever thought of leaving the country like us? No, this is our home. That's how my father and I used to feel, but as time goes on, that home's being destroyed for us. I don't think you can compare our situations, Leonie. Richard knows how to protect Georg. Apart from our boy's condition, we have no other major problems to deal with. Life's pretty good if you fall within the Führer's approved racist definitions. And anyway, who knows? Maybe the Olympics will change things in the summer. With the whole world coming to Germany for that, they'll have to ease off those restrictive laws at some point. Leonie sighed. Paula, as much as I value your optimism, I can't see it as you do. To be honest, I feel as though everything that's ever meant anything is collapsing around my ears. This gave Paula pause, as what Leonie had said could just as easily have come from Richard's lips. At the Langenhorn Asylum, Richard had long been accustomed to writing expert statements in a certain style. He continued to use his argument in favor of saving money by being more careful about indicating sterilization and was seen as a respected colleague. But his regular contact with Alfred Scher meant he knew how hard it was for the deaf and dumb. Scher was frequently asked to interpret at hereditary health trials, and what he had to tell was shocking. Even if someone was demonstrably the first deaf-mute in the family, this was no guarantee of their safety. There was an accumulation of expert opinion which assumed a new mutation and pronounced in favor of sterilization. While it had originally been Richard asking Alfred Scher for advice, now it was Scher who had to turn to Richard with complex questions, in the hope that Richard might find a loophole with which to influence the opinion of the court expert. Once Richard recognized that logical debate was not what this was about, he let slip during a phone conversation with Scher that he was protecting his son by means of a falsified medical certificate, according to which Georg had hearing difficulties due only to birth trauma, and that there was no indication whatsoever of anything hereditary. Scher listened attentively and invited Richard to come to his home in Hamburg's Volksdorf district in order to discuss the matter in more detail. Richard had already been there twice with Paula on social occasions, but when he asked if he might bring her this time, Scher said no. "I'd like you to come here alone this time, and park your car a couple of streets away." "That all sounds rather furtive." Richard tried to cover up his uncertainty with a gentle laugh. "Some things are better discussed in person than over the phone. I'll see you at 8. With this, Scher put down the telephone and Richard rang Paula to let her know he'd be home late. She seemed unconcerned by this, and as he could hear the children making a noise in the background, he didn't want to keep her, as much as he'd have loved to hear what she thought about Scher's odd behavior. At 8 o'clock sharp, he rang the doorbell. As requested, he'd parked his car a couple of streets away, though he still didn't understand why. Scher opened the door. "Quickly, come in, please." "Why, are the Gestapo after you?" Richard joked, but he paused when he saw Scher's expression. "What's wrong?" "My neighbors are rabid Nazis. In the last 6 months or so they've reported me because I let out 2 rooms to a Jewish family, and old Delbruck opposite has started noting down my visitors' registration plates. I'm on the blacklist around here." He let out a bitter chuckle. "The Gestapo have already called me in once in the last year to caution me." "What for? It isn't forbidden to rent to Jews." "Not yet," said Scher, "but it's not exactly encouraged, especially if you were on the Volksdorf Municipal Council until 1932, as I was, as a member of the SPD. As they talked, Scher led him through into the living room where 2 men were already seated. One looked very young, 20 at most. The other was around Richard's age. Klaus Weber and Matthias Olderog. Scher introduced them both to Richard, ISK comrades. The men got to their feet and shook hands with Richard. "ISK?" he asked. "Is that the International Socialist Action Group?" Scher nodded. "In a country where all political parties are banned, it's our job to preserve the values of liberty and to fight for a society free from exploitation." Richard cleared his throat. "I'm honored that you have so much faith in me, but I've really no interest in joining a forbidden organization." "You don't need to join anything at all," Matthias Olderog was quick to appease, "but your knowledge and professional competence could help us." "How's that?" "The same way you've helped your son," explained Scher. "We need respected experts to provide medical certificates that rule out hereditary illnesses or permanent damage. Without them, the people affected are simply being handed to this repressive regime on a plate." Richard swallowed hard. "And what illnesses are we talking about here? I'm a psychiatrist. I can't produce a certificate for a deaf-mute. It was hard enough finding someone to take on the risk for my son." "It's predominantly comrades who are suffering from shell shock," said Olderog. "Can you see yourself helping men like them?" Richard suddenly saw his brother before him, reduced to terror and helplessness by the slightest sound, unable to eat or drink, existing only in his own world. It brought back to Richard how powerless he himself had felt when their bad decision had put his brother in an asylum where he had been subjected to such merciless treatment that it had killed him. He swallowed hard again. "How far can I actually help, though? If the invalidity pension is suspended, there's little I can do. The current legal position doesn't leave much room for maneuver for any expert opinion, and even if one does support it, the pension authority is pretty much always opposed. It's only about confirming the full recovery of the individuals concerned, especially if they haven't been in receipt of the invalidity pension for a long time. Would you do that? Yes, I can see that working, but I don't fully understand why that's so important. We fear that what we're seeing now is just the beginning, explained Cher. Who knows where all this fanaticism about race and soundness of health is leading? The only people who are safe are those who are completely inconspicuous. Another problem is that most people are not aware of how dangerous the new legislation is, added Olderog. Anyone who's healthy and of pure blood in line with the new law and who isn't interested in politics will see only the sunny side and be bewitched by the cult of the Führer. But the more people cheer without really seeing, the further the Nazis will go, and we want to protect our comrades and all those considered weak and worthless by the regime. Just like you with your son. We have the same aim. I'll help you, said Richard, but I don't want my name to be associated with the ISK, precisely because I must protect my family and not put them at risk. That goes without saying, promised Cher. You'll be at your most useful to us if nobody knows that we're working together. That's why I asked you to park your car a couple of streets away. If anyone asks, this meeting never happened. He held out his hand in farewell. While his handshake was firm and confident, Richard's response was hesitant at first. His heart told him he was doing the right thing, but a warning had sounded in his head. He was on a tightrope here, and needed to be very careful. Chapter 28. The task turned out to be far easier than Richard had expected. The men concerned contacted him by telephone, and he would quite openly ask them to come during his consulting hours. For a year now, his work had required him to call in outpatients himself and personally assess them. Nobody was going to notice a couple of favorable statements here and there, especially as they had no impact on expenditure. He had agonized about confiding in Paula, but didn't want to worry her, especially as she had been so low since Leonie had left for Switzerland. In the end, he kept to his resolution never to have secrets from his wife. To his amazement, Paula showed no concern and was actually very proud of him for doing it. There'd be far less suffering if we had more doctors like you. And what's the worst that can happen? Someone could say you've made one wrong assessment and your reputation gets a bit of a dent. Doctors are allowed to make mistakes. It's not forbidden, and nobody will say you've done it on purpose. I only wish I could do more myself. You're already doing so much by being there for our children, replied Richard. Without you, Georg would never have made the progress he has. This wasn't just a compliment, but the truth. Paula practiced with Georg for several hours a day. He was learning how to do phonetic voice exercises while placing his fingers close to the larynx so he could feel the vocal cords vibrate, something which happened only when the sound was correctly produced. And so strong was the bond between the twins that his sister was almost always at his side, even though she could have chosen to play instead. Emilia took care to correct her brother if his speech wasn't clear enough, and had even invented her own sign to tell him so. The desire not to fall behind his sister spurred Georg on more than any of his parents' pleas and exhortations. However, it was a daily struggle, and there were often tears of frustration when Georg didn't want to carry on because it was so tiring for him, and he wanted to rely on signing instead. Paula was always mindful of Alfred Scher's advice to insist on the best from her son, although it hurt sometimes to demand so much of him. And so she practiced patiently with him, while trying to maintain a balance between strictness and kindness, sometimes pushing herself to the limit. But all of that was forgotten when Georg's speech continued to improve, and he could successfully sound out new and difficult words. He made good progress with lip reading, too. Paula practiced with him, talking to him without signing so that he could read it only by watching her lips. Then he had to repeat it back to her using sign language. What she had to watch out for was his sister standing behind her and secretly showing him the signs. The first time she caught Emilia doing this, both the children had burst out laughing and couldn't see anything wrong in what they were doing. "Emilia, you're not helping Georg by doing that." Paula managed to sound reproving while concealing her own amusement. In August, the twins were excited to be looking after Rudy the dachshund for a few days, while Fritz and his family went to Berlin to enjoy the Olympic Games, something they wouldn't have missed for anything. For Georg, any time spent with Rudy was a big incentive to improve his speech, because the Dachshund was really stubborn. He did what he was told only if the instructions sounded completely familiar to him. Otherwise, he would just stand there wagging his tail and gazing up at him with that trusting dachshund face. The evening before Fritz was due to collect him, Georg asked his father a question with the most perfect pronunciation. "Papa, can we have a dog too?" Richard was sure Georg had been practicing this sentence with his sister for ages. The children had worked out a long time ago that if Georg spoke clearly and well, there were always rewards. But Richard wasn't to be persuaded on this one. "You're both too young for that. Maybe when you start school." They were bitterly disappointed, and Richard was sure he hadn't heard the last of this one. Fritz came to collect Rudy the following evening, bursting with excitement. The games were magnificent. The whole city was decked out with the flags of every country you could think of. Not just pennants, but huge banners, 5 meters long, I'd say. For people with no stadium tickets, there were loudspeakers all over the place broadcasting announcements direct from the inside. And then there were these things called television suites, where you could go in and watch it all on a television set. Television? Richard looked puzzled. He hadn't heard this word before and imagined a room full of huge binoculars trained on the Olympic arena. "Haven't you seen the newsreel about it?" asked Fritz. Richard shook his head. "We haven't been to the cinema for a while." "It's a wooden chest bigger than an orange box." Fritz demonstrated the size with his hands, and Richard couldn't help but smile. His old friend never used to be one for gestures, but now that sign language was part of normal life in Richard's family, Fritz was unconsciously adapting his own style. "At the front there's a pane of glass called a screen. I spent so long getting the technician to explain it all to me that Dorothea got fed up waiting and Henrietta started grizzling." Fritz chuckled as he remembered the scene. When you switch it on, you see moving pictures on the screen. It's similar to the cinema, but the difference is that these pictures are created within the box and then transmitted onto the screen. The film recordings from the Olympic Stadium were broadcast in the same way, using radio waves, so that you could be in a television suite and still see what was happening inside the arena. Okay, these recordings weren't as clear as cinema newsreel, and you could often make out only shadowy figures, but I was really impressed by the technical side. Just imagine if everyone had a box like that at home. It would be better than the radio. You hear it, but have the pictures as well. It would be an absolute blessing for your boy. It's a shame nobody's thinking of mass production yet, but it's all too pricey at the moment." "That's a relief for the cinemas, I imagine," observed Richard. "That's true, yes, but there's no comparison with the big screen. Television can transmit only black and white pictures. The German Film Academy ought to be bringing more color films into our cinemas." "So did you actually see any sporting events, or just enjoy the technical novelties?" "Of course we did. We saw that miracle of a runner, Jesse Owens, in the 100-meter final in long jump. He pushed our Lutz Long into second place in the long jump, and Long congratulated him warmly. Near us, there was a Nazi in uniform making comments about how any German national comrade should be ashamed of embracing a Negro. I couldn't help but tell him that this was in keeping with the traditional spirit of the Olympics. Most of the crowd thought Long's gesture was the right thing to do and cheered Owens for his achievements. The man won 4 gold medals, after all. I pointed this out to my neighbor, and he told me it was no great surprise because Negroes are natural runners. Then he started talking about Darwin and claimed that it's genetically determined that only the fastest Negroes escaped being eaten by lions and could then reproduce. When I asked him if his knowledge of Africa came exclusively from those Tarzan films with Johnny Weissmuller, the conversation came to an abrupt end. Fritz laughed and Richard joined in. Then we saw Karl-Heinz's Olympic record in the hammer, and we were there when the women's 4x100 relay team were in line for a new world record, but lost the baton in the final and got disqualified. You should have heard the crowd like an earthquake. But the television made such an impression on me. It's technology that matters. However fast you can run, horses have always been faster, and since the motor car, well, Any old tortoise can outpace an Olympic champion. Sounds as though you had fun. Certainly did. Fritz was beaming with delight, and even though we'd gone to Berlin for the games, we made time to go to the Egyptian Museum as well and saw the bust of Nefertiti. But you'll never guess who we ran into there. His grin broadened. Maxwell Cooper, of all people, along with his wife and daughter. Maxwell Cooper? The name didn't ring any bells with Richard. My English colleague, the one from London I met up with at conferences, the one who showed me the surgical procedure for sterilization. Yes, I remember now. Anyway, there we were standing in front of Nefertiti, and we couldn't believe our eyes. It was so funny. Everyone else was still at the stadium, so we had the place pretty much to ourselves. All the Coopers are mad on ancient Egypt. They learned hieroglyphics even as children. Maxwell's brother is curator at the British Museum in London, and last time I was there, he showed me some of the rooms where they do restoration work that aren't usually open to the public. As a side interest, Maxwell researches causes of death in mummies. It's fascinating. Dorothea was a bit bored by it all, as she doesn't speak much English, and Maxwell and his wife speak no German at all. But that didn't stop Helen giving our little Henrietta a hug and telling me to bring Dorothea and the little ones with me next time I'm in London for a conference. But nothing will come of that for a while, not now Dorothea's pregnant again. You're having another baby? Richard was surprised and delighted. We certainly are. The baby's due end of January, early February. Just like before. At least I know when the mating season is for you two. Very funny. Fritz laughed and gave him a playful punch. On February 8, 1937, Fritz and Dorothea became parents to a healthy boy they named Harold, known by everyone as Hari. 3 days later, Richard was at his desk reviewing an expert statement when the phone rang. Elmer here. This is Matthias Olderog. Are you alone? He sounded hunted. Yes? Olderog's tone unsettled Richard. What's wrong? I wanted to warn you. Alfred Scher was arrested yesterday. There's been a countrywide operation against the ISK. Richard swallowed hard. What's he accused of? I don't know. He was summoned for questioning at the Gestapo headquarters at Stadthausbrücke, and then taken straight into custody. Is there anything I can do? No, I just wanted to inform you. If you get a summons from the Gestapo, just say you know Alfred only in his role as a deaf-mute teacher. Richard felt his hands go cold. There'd been rumors of torture in Gestapo prisons, but that had always seemed so far removed from himself and his own life. And yet now here was someone he viewed as a friend in the clutches of the Gestapo. At the same time, he realized it wasn't just Scher he was worried about. What would happen if he was summoned too? If he was arrested? What would happen to Paula and the children? Am I on their list? He struggled to keep his voice steady. How much danger is there? At the other end of the line, Olderog's breathing was uneven. Klaus and I won't say a word. I can't imagine that Alfred will give anything away, and you're not a member of the ISK in any case. But I'm very worried about Alfred. The Gestapo are known for their brutality. So is there nothing we can do? Nothing other than sit tight and wait until the danger is past. I have to go now. Once Olderog had hung up, Richard rang to inform Paula. She said nothing for a long time, and he was afraid they'd lost the connection. Eventually, she spoke. Don't worry. You've done nothing illegal. You've just done your job, and I don't believe Alfred Scher would name you. You're not important in this. Stay calm and wait. Over the next couple of days, Richard gave a start every time the phone rang, but there was no call from the Gestapo, and his life continued as normal. On the third day after Scher's arrest, Olderog rang again. I've got bad news. His voice was subdued, and Richard felt his stomach tense. Had Scher given him away? Were the Gestapo after him? Was Olderog warning him to disappear, and if he was, how could he when he had a wife and children? What Olderog said next shocked him out of his panic. Alfred is dead. Dead? Richard couldn't take it in. How can he be dead? They say he hanged himself in custody. Olderog's voice cracked, but I don't believe that. My fear is that they've overdone the interrogation and are covering it up as suicide. Richard took some deep breaths. Dead. Alfred Scher was dead. However often he repeated this to himself, his mind just couldn't take it in. But he was determined to the last and didn't betray anyone. Olderog's voice trembled with emotion. That should be some consolation to us. Didn't betray anyone. Dead. Determined. Richard couldn't concentrate. I simply can't believe it. It's a tragedy. He wanted to say something, but nothing felt right. My thanks to you, Herr Olderog. Do you know how Alfred's wife is? No, I'm avoiding contact with her at the moment, in case she's being watched by the Gestapo, and you should do likewise. Just live your life as before, Dr. Helmer. That's the best thing to do. With that, he rang off. Live life as before? What did Olderog envisage? And yet alongside his horror, Richard sensed something else, making its presence felt, and was ashamed of it. Relief. Cher had not given him away, and now he was dead, there was no fear of betrayal. When the full scope of this thought sank in, he wondered whether Cher had hanged himself as final proof that he was loyal, and had not betrayed comrades. Richard secretly hoped this was the case, because he wanted to remember Cher as a man who had taken his life to protect others, not as a man beaten to death by the Gestapo. Chapter 29. A few months after Cher's death, Richard was confident in his belief that any danger of his being in the Gestapo's sights had been banished once and for all. He had followed Olderog's advice and tried not to draw attention to himself, even though he still got calls from people wanting medical certificates. It was risky, but he turned no one away. He understood their desperation too well, and Paula was right behind him. Around the same time, his colleague Kruger joined the NSDAP and regularly deputized for the lead consultant. Richard wasn't too bothered, as Kruger rarely came to the secure unit, and the number of times he deputized as either senior or lead consultant could be counted on one hand. But then one morning in September, Paula phoned Richard at work. She sounded agitated. You've got a letter here from the Hamburg police headquarters at Stadthausbrücke. Richard froze. That was the Gestapo headquarters. Open it and read it out, would you? He heard her opening the envelope. Dear Dr. Helmer, she read, you are hereby required to attend the police headquarters at Stadthausbrücke 8, Department 2, Room 12, for questioning on Monday, September 27, 1937, at 11 a.m. sharp. It concluded with Heil Hitler and the name of the Hauptkommissar, Chief Inspector Gustav Liedeke. Richard's throat tightened. Department 2 meant the political police. Had someone linked him to Cher? You've nothing to blame yourself for. Paula did her best to calm him. You've nothing to feel guilty about. I know. But his mind was racing. What if someone had talked, mentioned him in relation to favorable expert statements, or denounced him in some other way? All of a sudden, he found himself thinking enviously of Leonie and her father's wise decision to move to Switzerland. She wrote to Paula on a regular basis. Did the Gestapo know about the letters? That his wife was in contact with Jews who had left the country? But that wasn't against the law. The fear that had gripped him after Cher's arrest came back now with a vengeance. Cher had been summoned like this, and never came back. That had been his second summons, though, and he had been a known member of the ISK. His first summons had just been a warning. Perhaps it would be the same for him. On the morning of September 27th, he bade his family a longer goodbye than usual, trying to imprint their expressions, their faces, their movements, everything about them into his memory, in case he never saw them again. The police headquarters was an imposing 3-story 18th-century Baroque building that from the outside gave no hint of the dark secrets within. As Richard made his way through the entrance hall, he considered how best to conduct himself. Anything the Gestapo thought they knew about him could only have come from informants. Perhaps it was time to dispense with his old aversion to the so-called German greeting and take the wind out of the Hauptkommissar's sails at the outset. Room 12 was on the first floor. He looked at his watch. 7 minutes to 11. Should he wait or knock straight away? He took 3 deep breaths and knocked. Come in. Richard opened the door, raised his right arm, and said, Heil Hitler. My name is Dr. Helmer. You wanted to see me? The official was sitting behind an enormous oak desk, but when Richard hailed him so promptly with the German greeting, he felt obliged to get to his feet and return the gesture. Richard noticed that there was an open newspaper beneath some files on the desk, as if the other man had tried hurriedly to hide it when he'd knocked. "You're rather early," observed the Kommissar. "We Germans are like that, always punctual. Do tell me how I can be of assistance to you, Herr Kriminalkommissar." Uncertainty flickered across the official's face. Few summoned would ever enter the room so full of self-confidence. Richard decided to carry on in the same vein. He wouldn't see himself as the accused, but as a respected doctor who took it in his stride to be questioned from time to time as an expert witness. "Do sit down," said Liedeke, gesturing at the chair on the other side of his desk. "Now, this is purely a routine matter. I had assumed so, Herr Kriminalkommissar. But like any decent German national comrade, I am ready at any time to stand shoulder to shoulder with the police to give advice and support. What can I do for you?" He leaned back in his chair in a relaxed fashion, noting how irritated this seemed to make Liedeke. And the more irritated the man became, the more confident Richard felt. He took in the room, noting the obligatory Hitler portrait hanging on the wall behind the desk, with a map of Hamburg to the left of it, while a few cacti decorated the window ledge. "It's been passed on to us that you knew Alfred Scher." "Scher? Oh yes, that's right, the deaf-mute teacher. He was recommended to me as a phonetics expert. That was... wait a moment, let me see... February 1933, soon after the seizure of power." "Why did you need a phonetics expert?" "It's like this." Richard hesitated a moment. "I don't know how much you know about me, so I'll go back a little. On August 9th, 1932, my wife gave birth to our twins. My daughter was born quickly and is a completely healthy little girl. For the birth, however, my son was a transverse presentation, which meant my wife's labor lasted for hours, and in the end, he was helped out with forceps. Sadly, this resulted in severe injury, but the extent of it became apparent only after several months. Since then, he's been very hard of hearing, and so of course we wanted to get him the best possible support so that he could learn to speak properly in spite of this tragic birth defect." Liedeke cleared his throat. "I'm sorry. I had been informed that your son was born deaf-mute." Richard's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly reverted to his role. "Really? Then you need to subject your informant to some tough questioning because he seems to have provided you with incorrect information. My son's speech is quite intelligible. Being very hard of hearing, he has to be able to see the face of whoever is talking to him in order to understand absolutely everything, but he is not a deaf-mute." Liedeke didn't pursue this and changed the subject. "I have also been informed that you're a doctor at Langenhorn Asylum and that you forbid your patients from using the German greeting." Richard gave a start. Who had told the Gestapo about that? And why? He pulled himself together. "Herr Kriminalkommissar, I'm amazed. The German greeting is for pure-blooded German national comrades born in good health. This is why the use of the German greeting is prohibited in the Rhineland during the carnival season, because it would be robbed of its dignity if used by any drunken Tom, Dick, or Harry. I assume you know about this." He left a dramatic pause to see what effect his words were having on Liedeke. He'd got this information from Fritz, who had in turn got the story from his cousin down in Cologne. "Yes, but..." "Now," said Richard, cutting across him, "you'll understand how odd it would sound to me, a psychiatrist, to be greeted with Heil Hitler by people who have no idea of the significance of this splendid word Heil and its association with noble German cultural anthems, but know it only in relation to the healing of illnesses. You can imagine how I would feel as a psychiatrist if my patients were to enter the room demanding that I heal our leader." He'd got so carried away by his own argument that he suddenly wondered if he'd overdone it. But a swift glance at Liedeke's face reassured him. The man was clearly not a hard nut, more a pleasant official who was gradually letting himself be won over by Richard's eloquent performance, reinforcing Richard's suspicion that some evil-intentioned colleague had informed on him, and the Gestapo were going into the case only as a matter of routine and had no concrete evidence against him. "If you would like me to, then I shall of course in future ask my patients to use the German greeting." said Richard in a more conciliatory manner. "That being the case, I'd like you to give me written authority that this is in line with the law and that it renders my patients equal to all national comrades born with good health. I wouldn't want to lay myself open to attack through any perceived disregard of our German greeting. I respect the Führer far too much for that. Do you have any further questions?" "No, none. Many thanks, Dr. Helmer, sir." Liedeke stood up. Before he could hold out his hand, Richard raised his right arm, clicked his heels, and said, "Heil Hitler." Liedeke swiftly collected himself and returned the greeting. Once Richard was outside the door, he calmed himself with some deep breaths. His acting had been second-rate, he thought to himself, but how fortunate that this official had fallen for it. Then he found himself wondering why he'd really been summoned. Liedeke hadn't said a word. Richard couldn't shake off the idea that Kruger was behind it. Kruger, who liked to know so much about his colleagues, and had rebuked him only a few weeks ago for not having his patients say Heil Hitler. And did Kruger know about Scher? He couldn't say with any certainty, and the concern lingered. He decided, however, to be much more careful from now on when it came to his own safety and that of his family. Chapter 30. "You should stop coming here, my dear Frau Helmer. You know it puts us both more than halfway to prison," Dr. Stamm reminded her. Paula noticed how much he had aged in the last few months. "Who could possibly stop me, sentimental woman that I am, from visiting my old boss from time to time and bringing my children along?" She gave him a comforting smile. Dr. Stamm was still her own children's doctor, in spite of the fact that he was no longer allowed to treat Aryan patients. Paula still relied on his advice and was able to get any of his recommended prescriptions made up for them by Fritz's father, a registered general doctor working in private practice. "My work as a doctor comes to an end on October 1st in any case," Dr. Stamm sighed. "A letter came yesterday saying that any certificate of appointment held by a Jewish doctor will lapse by September 30th. But provided we're not dispossessed, we can survive." Paula didn't know what to say. When she thought about it, though, and given everything that had been happening, she wasn't surprised. For the first time, she felt happy that Leonie and her father had gone to Switzerland when they did. "Have you ever thought of leaving our country?" "An old tree shouldn't be uprooted. I've been a patriot all my life and have put my heart and soul into my work as a doctor. First, they take away my fatherland and in the end my profession. But I'll get by somehow." "I'll carry on visiting you," Paula promised. "Only if it doesn't put you at risk, Frau Helmer. Otherwise, I could never forgive myself. And I could never forgive myself if I didn't stand by the people who mean something to me, and you're one of them, whether you like it or not." Was she imagining it, or were there tears in the elderly doctor's eyes? That evening, she told Richard the sad news. He took it in without a word. "Haven't you got anything to say about it?" she asked him. "I don't know what to say anymore. Sometimes I envy Fritz. He at least tries to enjoy the brighter side of the new Germany. He told me that in September they're going on a cruise with the KDF, that Strength Through Joy organization. They've booked a cabin on the Wilhelm Gustloff. The children will love it. Why haven't we been on any KDF cruises? I don't care for that kind of group activity, you know, when they're all promoting strength through joy." He made a face. "I'd rather have a couple of days in Hofkrug or Travemünde. Besides which, I have no desire to spend my holiday having to watch everything I say and playing at being the staunch national comrade." Paula sighed. Since Richard had been called before the Gestapo the previous year, he had changed. Even though he'd very deftly slipped the noose and had never heard from them again, he'd lost part of his natural optimism. In the meantime, he had found out for sure that it was Kruger who'd informed on him, because Dr. Harms had told him of a conversation he'd overheard between Kruger and Kleinschmidt. The pair had been greatly amused to note how amenable Helmer had become since their call to the Gestapo and the resulting summons. Previously, Richard had approached his work with real passion, always inspired by his desire to help people and make everything better. But ever since the supposedly deserving party comrade Dr. Kruger had taken over the lead consultant role and become Richard's superior, things had changed. Resources intended for the good of the people were no longer to be squandered on inferior beings, and it was hard for him to get anything at all for his patients. In the past, Richard had always been able to rely on Dr. Harms, but he had handed in his notice and started a new post in Brandenburg following a vehement disagreement with Kruger a few weeks previously. All this gnawed away at Richard, and since Harms's resignation, he had seriously been considering applying to the asylum at Lüneburg, simply to escape the poisonous atmosphere at Langenhorn. Sadly, there wasn't a suitable school there for Georg, so Richard gritted his teeth and hoped for better times ahead. In August, it was time for the twins to start school. Emilia joined the reception class at the local school in Rotenbergsort, only a short walk from home, while Paula took Georg to the deaf and dumb school in Bürgerweide, accompanying him herself in the early weeks until she felt sure he could do the tram journey alone. For the twins, it was a major adjustment to be separated from each other for several hours a day and to make new friends. Georg was disappointed that his best friend Horst had started school with Emilia and not with him, but after a few days at the new school he managed to put these concerns aside because for the first time in his life he was with children of his own age who couldn't hear either. It was a new experience for him to be understood immediately whenever he used sign language without first having to explain that he couldn't hear. On top of that, he soon became a favorite of the teaching staff because his speech was so good, and he was often used as an example for the others. At first, Georg enjoyed being in this position, but he soon realized that there were disadvantages, as he suffered the jealousy and aggression of those who couldn't speak and who begrudged him his special place. Richard felt a strong empathy with his son during this period in their lives because it so much reminded him of his time at university. As the academically gifted son of a carpenter, he had found there were plenty of students from wealthy homes who held his social class against him. At the same time, he always remembered what Cher had once said to Paula, that deaf people have to make a choice and decide whether to belong to the world of the hearing or to the world of the deaf-mute. So he encouraged his son not to be put off by jealous children, telling him he was better than them in every respect. "But what do I do if they beat me up?" asked Georg one evening. "Willi has threatened to give me a thrashing." "When he starts to do that, you've got to punch him as hard as you can right on the nose." "Richard, shouldn't you be advising him to go to his teacher?" Paula sounded reproachful. "He's tried that already, but it doesn't help if Willi's lying in wait for him on the way to school, and you can't be there with him all the time. So if someone goes for you, Georg, you hit them back as hard as you can." Richard took a cushion off the sofa and held it up in front of him. "Now, show me how hard you can thump it." Georg punched the cushion with his fist. "Not hard enough. You want to thump him, not stroke him. Have another go." Georg laughed and did it again. By now, Emilia had joined them. "Can I do it too?" "Good, yes. Off you go." Emilia punched the cushion. "That's a good punch, Emilia. You could be a boxer." "Or thrash Willi if he does anything to Georg," Emilia giggled. Paula intervened. "Richard, do you really think violence is a solution?" "No, but I believe in self-defense. Come on, Georg, have another go." When Willi threatened Georg again the following day, Georg addressed him in sign language. "Okay then, you get first go. But I'm ready, and I'm warning you, I did boxing with my dad yesterday." Willi hesitated, and Georg noticed how his own fear vanished. "What's up?" Georg asked. "Are you scared? It's just as well, otherwise I'd be showing you how a real boxer does it." He raised his fists, and Willi stepped back. "I'm not going to talk to you anymore, you stupid swat," signed Willi and walked off. That day he started to spread the rumor that Georg's dad was a real boxer and was teaching his son how to do it. When Georg related all this to his father, Richard laughed, but said it wasn't right to make too much of a fool of Willi and that he'd better let everyone know the truth. "If a young hooligan like Willi is scared of you, that's a good thing, Georg. Any deterrent that helps avoid a fight is always better than actually having the fight." So is telling a lie allowed? Piped up Amelia, listening intently next to her brother. If by telling a lie you can prevent someone from doing something bad, then that's all right, yes. Telling lies is only bad if you do it deliberately to harm other people or to disadvantage others who don't deserve it. In the background came Paula's voice. You seem to have a rather casual approach to the truth. Yes, he said without hesitation, but in times like this, it's vital. Paula picked up the hidden message, but Emilia and Georg just laughed, unaware of the full implications of their father's remark. Chapter 31 Friday, September 1st, 1939. So glad you could come, colleague Helmer. Please do take a seat. Kruger indicated the chair in front of his desk. Richard paused before doing so. Kruger's warm welcome made him wary. Your assessment skills are well known to me, and this is why you're just the right man for a new assignment. What's it about? It's about registration of our patients in the context of the economic plan. You, with your wide-ranging competence in preparing expert statements, are ideally suited to the job. Kruger's arrogant smile confirmed what Richard suspected. A thankless, burdensome task to be delegated to the most unpopular colleague. In some ways it made him angry, but he could also see that it might be another chance to avoid reprisals against his patients. What exactly is this registration? The state would like a survey that registers all the mentally ill and feeble-minded who have lived in the asylum for more than 5 years, or who are no longer employable, or who can be considered only for the simplest of tasks. Your job is to complete a registration form for every single patient, giving the individual's capacity for productivity. Richard immediately wondered whether this new set of expert statements had something to do with the food stamps and petrol coupons that had come in for the first time on Monday, all stamped with today's date. A week ago, Paula had got hold of as many provisions as she could lay her hands on, while he himself had filled up the car, as well as 2 spare petrol cans. Far worse than the fuel shortage, though, was the growing threat of war. Were rations going to be reduced even further for the sick and unproductive if war came? He put these worrying thoughts out of his mind and asked a question instead. And what are the consequences for patients of this classification exercise? You needn't trouble yourself with that. That's the job of the state. Before Richard could respond, there was a loud knock on the door. It was Kruger's secretary, Frau Handelo. Dr. Kruger, sir, you must switch on your wireless, she cried. Kruger was clearly irritated at the intrusion, but as it was so out of character for his normally restrained secretary, he immediately did as she asked. Richard glanced at his watch. 10:15. Overnight, Poland has for the first time opened fire on our own territory using regular soldiers. Hitler's voice rasped through the ether. Since 5:45, fire has been returned. From now on, any bomb will be repaid with a bomb. He who fights with poison will receive poison gas in return. He who does not abide by the rules of humane warfare should expect the same from us. I will wage war in the same way against anyone and for however long is required in order to guarantee the security of the empire and of its rights. We're at war. Frau Handelo sounded very agitated, but everyone said it wouldn't come to this. You're surprised? Richard was amazed at how calm he felt. Instead of leaping to his feet and screaming out his frustration and hatred of the government, he felt like a detached observer. So why did you think petrol coupons were handed out on Monday? All the more important now that we get on with our duties, said Kruger, casting a warning look in Richard's direction. The resources of our people must be fairly distributed in these difficult times. You understand, I hope, how much depends on your future work, colleague Helmer. Richard nodded. I understand perfectly and will carry out this work with the utmost conscientiousness. Kruger gave a pompous little nod of the head that Richard knew meant he could now leave the room. He rang Paula without delay. Have you just heard the radio? Yes, Frau Walter next door rang our bell to tell me to listen. I can't believe it, Richard. I know we feared it, but did we really believe it could happen? Do you think it'll stay as a conflict with Poland, or Will the English get involved now? I have no idea, but it doesn't look good. Kruger has just told me that from now on I have to assess all our patients for their capacity for productivity. The government's providing registration forms, and I'm expected to separate out those who can no longer do any productive work or who've been at the asylum for more than 5 years. Why? My guess is to curtail food rations. Kruger was very cagey about it. What'll you do? Follow my conscience. Kruger wants to humiliate me with this tedious work, but what he doesn't realize is that it gives me a degree of power. I'll have to wait and see what these forms look like, and then I'll know how much room for maneuver there is. By the way, it would be a good idea if you could get out today and buy everything you can find that doesn't need food stamps or petrol coupons. We don't know what the supply situation's going to be in the next few weeks. Yes, Frau Walter was saying the same. I'll go now before the children get home from school. Richard finished work early that day to go and fill up the car again. There was already a long queue for the pump. When it was his turn, the attendant first asked for his coupon. He handed it over and waited while the man filled the tank for him. One tank lasted him a week, but had just cost him a whole month's ration. This old girl's in good nick, said the attendant, taking a look at the vehicle. Adler Standard 6. You don't see many of those now. What's the year, 1928? Actually, it's 1927, said Richard. It's never let me down, even took me over the Alps. My brother-in-law would give you good money for a car like that. Thanks, but I'm totally dependent on it, he said before paying the man and driving home. That evening, he phoned Fritz. How are you getting on with the petrol rationing? He asked. I take the tram to work and save the fuel for the weekends. Dorothea thinks I should sell the car, but it's 10 years old, and if rationing goes on, I'll never get rid of it and won't have any fuel either. What about you? I can't do without it. You know how bad the tram connections are out to Langenhorn. It'd add an hour to the day every morning and then again in the evening. But will your ration let you go on driving there every day? No, I'll get through it in just a week, replied Richard. I could let you have my winter coupon, suggested Fritz straight away. Doro and I don't go away at the weekends at that time of year. Would you really do that? Gives me a good reason to hang on to the car. I'll say to Doro, no car, no coupon. He chuckled. So you're definitely not going to sell it? No, because who knows when I could ever afford another one. Maybe I'm being pessimistic. Maybe this nightmare will be over in a couple of weeks. That's what everyone said in 1914. Richard's voice had a bitter edge to it. At first, Fritz said nothing, but Richard sensed that his friend had something he wanted to say. Finally, Fritz said, Let's not look on the dark side, Richard. Come round for a beer tomorrow. At least that's not rationed. And then I can give you the coupon and one of my spare cans. I'll ask around a bit to see if anyone else wants to sell coupons. That'll keep you going for a while, won't it? Now that's a real friend, said Richard, laughing, sharing his last drop of fuel. Hey, at least we won't need to share our last shirt. The army will be providing them soon enough. Fritz, you don't seriously think people in our position will be called up? Well, I don't know the situation for psychiatrists, but we surgeons are in demand. Professor Wehmeyer said only this morning that he's expecting the call-up for military doctors to start at any moment. I won't be volunteering, of course, but lots of my younger colleagues see it differently and think it's a way of advancing their careers. Oh well, as long as there are enough volunteers, nobody'll think of calling us up. Let's leave it like this. You're coming round for a beer tomorrow and we'll drink to this war being over by Christmas, not like back in 1914. If drinking to it helped, I'd cheerfully become an alcoholic. Watch out there. Didn't you tell me alcoholics have to be sterilized? I can take the risk. My family's complete. Fritz cleared his throat. Hey, Fritz, are you telling me Dorothea's expecting again? What on earth makes you think that? No, our family was complete when Harold came along. He laughed. I'd risk being an alcoholic and drinking to peace, but shaky hands aren't too good in the operating theater. See you tomorrow, and a toast to peace, said Fritz firmly, looking forward to it. Then he put down the receiver. Chapter 32. Early in October, Richard made a start on the first batch of forms. It was tedious work, hard grind too, but he got a new typewriter for it. This was because at the top of these new forms, heavily underlined and festooned with exclamation marks, was the instruction that forms were to be typed, not handwritten. Next to personal details was a space headed Race. Richard shook his head in disbelief when he read the options he had to choose from. Of German blood or related, Jew, Jewish mixed blood grade 1 or 2, Negro or Negro mixed blood. Good thing he had no Indians or Chinese among his patients, he thought with a bitter irony. He couldn't have classified them at all. In addition to this, he had to give information about whether a patient received regular visitors, whether the patient was a war veteran or a twin, and whether there were any mentally ill blood relatives. Then came all the questions about diagnosis, symptoms, treatment, the course of illness, and any criminal offenses. At the end, the patient's occupation and degree of productivity had to be compared with the average performance of a healthy individual for the same work. So this was the loophole he needed. The standards for comparison with the average person were not specified. It was for the expert witness himself to make his own estimate. Richard first set to work on the files for those patients based in the open country houses. They all worked in agriculture, so he compared their capacity for work with that of the average agricultural worker. He gave 80% to those he knew were barely capable, and pondered what plausible reasons he could find to disguise the true extent of their condition. His secure unit patients, however, presented him with greater problems, particularly when he saw Herbert's file in front of him. Herbert, his old patient, the first one he'd worked with so intensively and who, through his repeated failures, had demonstrated to Richard that he simply could not cope outside the secure unit. He had now known the man for 10 years, and an almost affectionate relationship had developed between them, in spite of their being worlds apart. Richard had worked his way up from being a young and inexperienced junior doctor to a consultant and a recognized writer of expert statements, while Herbert had simply grown older. He was as charming as ever, and had managed to improve his concentration, which meant that he could now work for a few hours on simple tasks, such as making paper bags. But despite spending a long time thinking about how he could, at least on paper, make the capability of this severely ill patient look better, Richard finally had to acknowledge that there just wasn't a way. 50% was perhaps plausible, but he would be hard-pushed even to justify that. Anything higher just would not wash. It seemed, though, at least for now, that the completion of the forms had no particular consequences, and when rations for the secure unit were barely reduced, Richard felt he could breathe more easily. The supply situation in Germany remained stable, although petrol rationing became a constant problem for most drivers. Thanks to Fritz, Richard had enough fuel to carry on going to work by car. That wasn't entirely due to Fritz's personal generosity, but owed a great deal to the black market contacts that he had been cultivating. Black market petrol coupons were expensive and illegal, but Fritz took the view that it didn't matter whose car was filled up as long as the coupons were genuine. When Richard asked him how he'd managed to get these contacts, Fritz explained how 3 weeks back he'd started working Saturday afternoons as a prison doctor in Fuhlsbüttel. The previous prison doctor decided to join up and they couldn't fill the vacancy. It was circulated among us as a fee-paying role, so I went for it. The money's good, and it reduces the likelihood of my getting called up if I'm holding down 2 important jobs. Besides, you get to meet some rather interesting people with even more interesting connections. He grinned. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France did indeed declare war, but this made no appreciable difference to daily life. In October, Hitler announced that the Polish campaign had concluded successfully. The German military now turned its attention to the Western Front and France. Richard's nephews were called for scrutiny, and the 2 eldest were conscripted. This was a blow for Richard's father, as Karl had only just become a master craftsman and was set to take over his grandfather's business. In addition, the outbreak of another war stirred old memories. "The last war took my eldest son from me," said Richard's father sadly. "I don't want this one to take my 2 eldest grandsons." Richard tried hard to reassure his parents, his sister, and her husband Holger, but the very words "French campaign" filled the 4 of them with such horror that even he could not lift their spirits. The last war had broken his brother. But Richard had always believed that Holger had somehow weathered the whole experience, mentally at least, and had even come to terms with the loss of part of his leg. Margit, however, now told him a different story, of how Holger had regularly suffered nightmares since his 2 sons had been called up, just as he had in the first few years after his own war. Sometimes, she told Richard sadly, Holger seemed to be in another world, and she would have to call his name several times before he came to again. This caused Richard grave concerns as he recognized these symptoms from other severely traumatized men, and yet Holger's experiences lay 20 years in the past. Could it be that the anxiety over his sons had brought back the mental trauma they all believed he had overcome? While Richard stayed strong on the outside for the sake of his family and continued to do everything he could for Holger and Margit, it was Paula who kept him afloat. She kept saying that they couldn't compare this war with the last one, and was firm about Richard still taking her to the cinema and watching the positive newsreel reports. The German army was on the advance, was victorious. This was not trench warfare like the last time. In his heart, Richard knew these newsreels were nothing more than clever propaganda, but he was only too willing to be taken in as it gave him the strength to give moral support to Holger and Margit. Karl and Jürgen would come unscathed through the war and be home soon. That was all that mattered. At Christmas, Karl and Jürgen came home on leave. As the lads recounted their adventures, there were moments when the war lost its horror. Their stories sounded more like wild escapades and seemed entirely different to the terrors experienced by their father Holger and Uncle Georg. "If it carries on like this, it'll be springtime in Paris for us," said Karl, full of confidence as he tucked into the Christmas roast. "We'll send you a postcard of the Eiffel Tower," added Jürgen with the same smile he'd had when he'd been the little rascal at Richard and Paula's engagement party, secretly pilfering biscuits from the celebration table with his brothers and little sister. Richard's heart ached at the memory. Had that really been 12 years ago? After the Christmas meal, Richard took a photograph of the whole family, Karl and Jürgen in uniform in the middle, 2 young men full of the joy of life, their military duty hopefully soon a thing of the past, because their grandfather needed them in the workshop. By the time Richard developed the photograph in his makeshift darkroom at home a couple of days later, his nephews were already on their way back to the front. "That turned out well," said Paula, when she saw the photograph hung up to dry. "Yes." "Something wrong?" "I've been thinking about Georg such a lot recently. He had the same bravado as those 2 at the beginning of the war, and this photo reminds me of the one my father took before he left. It was the whole family with Georg, so proud to be wearing the Kaiser's uniform. He left here a proud young man with his whole life ahead of him, and came back a wreck. But Karl and Jürgen have no recollection of that. After all, they weren't born until 1917 and 1919. He paused. "Have you noticed Holger's and Margit's eyes? Have you seen the worry in them?" "Yes, I know exactly what you mean. All parents are worrying about their sons, and Holger knows better than anyone what war means. I worry too. On days like this, I wish I was a believer. Believers can at least pray." Paula looked up at him, her gentle hands on his shoulders. "Whatever happens, Richard, we'll get through it together. The whole family." It was a hard winter. Richard was fearful for his nephews, although the field post from the 2 of them was always bursting with confidence and entertaining anecdotes. He wondered whether these letters were genuine or whether they were simply to reassure the folks back home. Either way, they had their desired effect. Holger regained his old resolve, and Margit told Richard the nightmares had stopped. Life carried on as usual for a while in spite of the food stamps and petrol coupons. Meanwhile, the Reich clothing ration card was introduced, restricting the purchase of new clothes through a points system. Every German had 100 points for 1 year, and these were deducted according to purchases made. A pair of stockings worked out at 4 points. A pullover put a 25-point dent in your card, and at the beginning of February, Paula's new suit cost her no less than 45 in one go. Richard teased her. "Oh well, you can still afford 13 pairs of stockings and 1 sock for the rest of the year." "You shouldn't be so stingy with your own points. Do get yourself a couple of new shirts," retorted Paula as she looked at herself in the bedroom mirror in the new suit. "Your clothes are starting to look so threadbare." On the previous day, Richard had intervened in a violent struggle between patients, and the seam of his shirt had been ripped in the process, although Paula had been able to mend it for him. "Oh, they're not that bad, and anyway, yesterday's incident was only the second like that since I started there." He deliberately played it down, although he was sure that incidents like this would increase, as the change he had feared for some time had now come into force. The reduction in food rations for all inmates who couldn't make a productive contribution. The atmosphere became increasingly tense, as it had during the economic crisis, and there were more and more outbursts of aggression in the secure unit. While Richard had come out of it with a torn shirt, Kurt Hansen had ended up with a nasty bite on his forearm. By March, Richard was more relieved than usual to feel the gradual arrival of spring, as the temperature finally moved above freezing and the snow melted. On the last Friday of March 1940, Richard arrived at work earlier than usual as the streets were clear of snow and very few cars were on the road due to the scarcity of petrol. It was still dark as he drew up in front of the secure unit and saw a large black bus in his parking spot. Richard parked next to it and went into the building. Kurt was already there looking out for him. "Did you know about the transfer?" He sounded upset. "What transfer?" Richard was alarmed. "All secure unit patients are being taken to an institution in Brandenburg. That bus was outside here really early and we were ordered to pack everybody's things." "This is all news to me. Who gave the order?" "Dr. Kruger came here yesterday after you'd left and made the announcement, but he didn't say the bus was coming today. He said something about a transfer in the next few days. I thought we'd have a bit of time to work out what was going on. Kruger said there's going to be some restructuring. Some of the country houses are to be set aside for children, and our own asylum inmates will be transferred to the secure unit. Our good Dr. Kruger seems to be extending his expertise to include the children's department at Langenhorn. As far as I know, he's good friends with Dr. Bayer, the senior consultant at the Children's Hospital in Rotenburgsort," said Richard. "My wife used to work there and is still in touch with an old colleague. I don't know any more than that." "Dr. Helmer, why must we go away?" Herbert had seen Richard and Kurt talking outside Richard's office and made straight for them. The uncertainty in his eyes was obvious, and Richard wanted to reassure him, as he would do with a child. "I presume it's because there's better food in the country. Here, the city provisions are really not so good now because of the war." He didn't know whether there was any truth in what he said, but he wasn't going to let Herbert see his own uncertainty, and anyway, his theory was quite logical. Why else would all the patients be moved to Brandenburg? "Kurt, tell me something," said Richard, turning to his senior nurse while Herbert still stood anxiously next to them, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Isn't Brandenburg where Dr. Harms went?" Kurt Hansen nodded. "You see," Richard said to Herbert, "you know someone there already. You always got on well with Dr. Harms, didn't you?" Herbert's face lit up. "Yes, he's a nice man. Maybe there are cows there, too." "And no pubs to lead you into temptation," added Richard with a smile. "But I don't do that anymore," replied Herbert sincerely, with an innocent expression. Kurt Hansen rolled his eyes while Richard patted Herbert on the shoulder in farewell. "Perhaps there'll be new opportunities for you there. I wish you the very best." "Thank you, Dr. Helmer." For the last time, he gave Richard his trusting smile, then set about gathering up his bags before climbing onto the secure bus, which also contained a number of men in uniform. An hour later, Richard and Kurt Hansen walked together through the empty building where they had worked together for almost 11 years. "It feels somehow dead," said Hansen, "like a grave." "Yes, I feel like someone's walking over mine this very minute. When are the new residents arriving?" "No idea. I hope Dr. Kruger will give us due warning this time." "Maybe you could ask him. You know he has no time for me," said Richard. "What makes you think he's got any time for me? He never saw our patients as human beings. To him, they were only ever unpleasant cost factors, and every act of aggression here simply confirmed his opinion." Lost in thought, Kurt ran his finger over the fading bite mark on his forearm. Perhaps Brandenburg really will be better for our patients, commented Richard. After all, Dr. Harms went there to get away from Kruger's views, and he always shared ours. Let's hope so. I'd be really glad for Herbert and all the others if they could have a new start there, added Hansen, his mind still preoccupied. Richard waited throughout the morning to hear whether the residents from elsewhere in the asylum would be moving into the secure unit, or whether Dr. Kruger was about to divulge something different. His telephone rang.
This is the end of disc number 5. Please insert disc number 6. This is disc number 6.
Richard, it's me, Margit. His sister's voice was thick with emotion. A letter's come for Holger. Jürgen fell on March 21st. My God, shouted Richard. Oh, Margit, I'll come straight away. How has Holger taken the news? He's with Papa and both the journeymen on the way to our woodland to get new timber. They're not due back until this evening. He doesn't know yet. What on earth do I say to him? She broke down in tears. Nothing, Margit. I'll talk to him. I'll drive straight to where they are. But can you really just leave work like that? No question. All my patients have been taken to Brandenburg, and the others aren't coming for a couple of hours. I'll ring Paula, and she'll come and keep you company while I let Papa and Holger know. Thank you, Richard. Margit, there's nothing to thank me for. You're my sister. I'm here for you, whatever happens. He hung up, then phoned Paula to tell her what had happened. She was as horrified as he was and promised to take care of poor Margit. Then he went to find Kurt Hansen. I have to leave straight away, Kurt. If anyone's asking for me, you can tell them my nephew has been killed. I must go to support my sister. Hansen was white-faced. Which nephew is it? Oh, Richard, I'm so very sorry. Richard blinked back the tears. The younger one, Jürgen. He would have been 21 next month. This is terrible for you all. Please tell your sister and her whole family that I'll pray for them to stay strong. Thank you, Kurt. The roads were even emptier now, and Richard reached the family's woodland plot just outside Hamburg faster than he'd expected. His father and brother-in-law were hard at work checking the quality of the trees they'd felled that day, while the 2 young journeymen loaded the timber that had passed muster onto the truck. But as soon as they saw Richard's car, they stopped what they were doing. His father walked over, smiling. What brings you over here at this time of day? His smile froze the moment he saw the look on Richard's face. What's happened? Margit phoned me. Then Richard turned to Holger. Holger, a letter came for you this morning. What kind of letter? Richard saw his brother-in-law start to tremble. It was clear he already feared the worst. Jürgen has fallen. Holger looked stunned. Richard's father cried out, No, please no. The 2 lads, horrified, let go of the logs they were about to heave onto the vehicle and blurted out condolences. Holger couldn't take it in. His eyes couldn't leave Richard's face. And Karl? His voice was shaking. We've heard nothing from Karl. Jürgen, whispered Holger. He was always so careful, so cautious. How could it happen? I don't know, Richard replied, carefully assessing his brother-in-law. Was he really as composed as he appeared, or would he break down? Given what Margit had told him of late, he feared the latter. And we've heard nothing from Karl? Holger asked again. I'm sure he's not been harmed, said Richard, although he felt no certainty about this. It was the second time this morning he'd had to make things look more positive than they were. He's bound to write you both soon with what actually happened. Holger said nothing, but his hands were trembling violently now, and reminded Richard uncomfortably of his brother Georg. Can I drive you home, Holger? Papa, Ernst and Hans will take care of everything here. Yes, my son, said Richard's father, resting his hand consolingly on Holger's shoulder. Let Richard take you home. Margit needs you. Holger nodded without a word and let himself be helped into Richard's car. The journey passed in silence. Holger was deep in thought, and Richard thought it best to leave him be. As soon as they arrived, Holger and Margit fell into each other's arms. No words came. Just as they let one another go, Lotjen came from school, saw her parents in distress, and ran to them. Holger held his daughter close and wept silently. In that silence, Richard, not a religious man, found himself praying fervently for Karl's safe return. Chapter 33. That there could be no burial in Ohlsdorf Cemetery was especially hard for Holger and Margit to bear. Jürgen had been laid to rest in some military cemetery between Belgium and France. He was to have no gravestone, just a plain wooden cross, like the hundreds already in place and the thousands more Richard feared would follow. He no longer believed the weekly newsreel. In the meantime, he had found out how Jürgen had died and what this meant for Karl. His two nephews, with a few other soldiers, had become separated from their company and fallen straight into an ambush. The ever-vigilant Jürgen was one of the first to spot it. Karl would have run straight into it had Jürgen not pulled him down at the last minute, fatally wounded by a ricocheting bullet as he did so. His comrades returned fire while Karl gave his brother first aid, even managing to get him to the nearest field dressing station. But there was nothing the doctor could do. The bullet had lodged deep in Jürgen's heart, and the pericardium had filled with blood, leaving no room for the vital organ to beat. The attempt at emergency surgery, which had a questionable outcome in any case, had come too late. Since then, Karl had suffered unbearable guilt because Jürgen had been shot while trying to protect him. He couldn't bring himself to tell his parents of his guilt and his failure to save Jürgen, but his inner torment drove him to confide in his uncle Richard by letter. In reply, Richard wrote, "Dear Karl, I feel the deepest of sympathy for you and share with you the loss of your brother. But you bear no guilt for Jürgen's death. Your brother acted instinctively to protect you, as you did for him when you risked your life by crossing the lines to get him to the nearest field hospital. If anyone is guilty, then it is the man who fired that bullet, or those who gave the order to open fire. Guilt also lies with whoever forced you to leave your family to occupy France. There are many people who are guilty of Jürgen's death, but you are not one of them. You are free of all guilt because you are a fine and loyal brother. Jürgen loved you as much as you did him. He gave his life to save yours, and you should honor his memory and commemorate him with love and a sense of solidarity, while you live the life that he saved and enjoy it in all its beauty. If you poison your life with self-accusation and tear yourself apart inside, then your brother's sacrifice will have been in vain because he won't have saved your life, he'll only have saved your body. You know that Jürgen would want you to come back safely and somehow to find your old joy in life again. Be honest, Karl, that's what you'd have wanted Jürgen to do if it had happened the other way around. You wouldn't have wanted him constantly to punish himself about it, or to weigh himself down with self-reproach. I know these words sound hollow and empty while you're still mourning, but once the initial pain has passed, read these words again and let them help you. I empathize with how you feel because I have experienced the same helplessness and guilt at being the survivor, although in very different circumstances. This was when your Uncle Georg died. I know you barely remember him. I persuaded our father, your grandfather, to take Georg to a mental hospital. I genuinely believed it would help him, but instead, he died a terrible death there. If anyone carried the guilt for that, it was me, because I was the one who sent my dear brother to a place where unscrupulous doctors subjected him to horrific treatment that tortured him to death. That was when I decided to be a psychiatrist, so that this could never happen again. Never again. It brings nothing to keep on asking what would have happened if. It is as it is. We can't turn back time, but we can give thought to what we can do differently and better in the future. I can't tell you which path to take in dealing with your loss. I got back my joy in life once I'd worked out what gave my life meaning. Once I'd explained to your grandfather that I wouldn't be taking over the workshop, but wanted to study medicine instead, he immediately understood and did nothing to stand in my way. From the bottom of my heart, I want you, too, to find something that gives your life meaning, no matter what it is. It's not that you may find happiness again. It's your duty to do so. Our dead brothers have long absolved us of guilt because they know we've done everything in our power for them. The fact that it wasn't enough to protect them is tragic, and we have to live with that loss. We mustn't poison the life and memory of each of our brothers, but must instead show ourselves worthy of their love and forgiveness. This is why I chose to call my own son Georg. Think of a way of keeping Jürgen in your life, and remember him with warmth and love. Your Uncle Richard. 10 days after Richard had sent this letter, Margit told him that Karl had at last written and told them how Jürgen had died. "I know," was all Richard said in response. He, too, had just received a letter from Karl. "Dear Uncle Richard, thank you for your letter, which has given me so much valuable insight and understanding. I'm going to follow your advice in every way, and when we get to Paris I'm going to do what Jürgen and I always planned. That's to climb up the Eiffel Tower, send you all a postcard, and then at last come home, where I know more than enough woodwork awaits me in the workshop, and then I plan to lead a normal life. Your nephew, Karl." When he showed Karl's letter to Paula, she said, "Karl's lucky to have not just a good uncle, but a good psychiatrist, too. He will cope." "Yes, I'm sure he will, but I'm still concerned. As long as this damned war goes on, no one can be sure of coming out alive. But it looks all right at the moment. Our troops are edging across France without any static warfare. Sounds like the newsreel I don't set any store by. So what do you set store by? What do you hold on to get through it all? You, my dearest Paula, you're worth more to me than any newsreel." He gave her a loving kiss on the cheek. A lot had changed in the asylum at Langenhorn. The secure unit was no longer that, and the new patients had the right to leave the building and work on the land. There were difficulties only when aggressive new arrivals came. One of the 2 observation rooms was set aside for new admissions, while the other was used by peaceful former residents of the open country houses. But it was getting overcrowded. There were now 18 beds in each room instead of the previous 12, and even one of the day rooms had been converted into a dormitory. On top of that, Richard was still required to complete the registration forms assessing patients' productivity. These were then dispatched to an address in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4. One sunny morning in April, just 4 weeks after Herbert and the other patients had been transferred to Brandenburg, Richard's telephone rang. "Dr. Helmer speaking. Helmer, it's Harms here. Are you alone there in the office?" "Dr. Harms, this is a surprise." Richard's voice came joyfully down the line. "Yes, I'm on my own here. Have our patients settled with you all right? How's our old friend Herbert?" Dr. Harms cleared his throat before speaking. "Listen, this is strictly confidential and nobody must know, but I can't go along with what's happening, and you have to know what's going on here." "What on earth do you mean? Am I right in thinking that you're still completing those registration forms about productivity?" "Yes. They're using the information to separate out the lives considered unworthy of life. Every patient deemed economically unproductive is being murdered." There was a sharp intake of breath from Richard. "Did I hear you right? Patients are being murdered? Who by? I know it sounds impossible, and I don't think anyone other than you will believe me, but this is the truth. All our former patients from the secure unit are now dead. A few days after their arrival, they were bundled into sealed airtight lorries that were driven into the forest and had carbon monoxide pumped into them until everyone was dead." Richard froze. Had Harms gone crazy, or had he developed a strange version of black humor? This has got to be some kind of joke, surely. Why would doctors tolerate something like that and risk a jail sentence for being an accessory to murder? What would they get out of it? And why are you telephoning me and not the police if you're witness to something like this? "I know how it must sound, Dr. Helmer, but this is the truth." Harms spoke very firmly. "This is why I have handed in my notice, but because I am in the know, they don't want to let me go, so I've had to come up with something to get myself out. So I've volunteered to go to the front as a doctor. I'd rather that than take part in mass murder here. You don't believe me? The orders are coming right from the very top. From Hitler himself. They call it mercy killing, and it's subject to the utmost secrecy. It's the extermination of life unworthy of life, just like Professor Hoch described in his book in the 20s. This lot are taking it really seriously. First the sterilization program, then the killing of all those no longer deemed fit for work. In Tiergartenstrasse in Berlin, there are doctors whose only task is to assess the registration forms and separate out all those who are no longer productive. They're the ones that get sent to Brandenburg. Apparently, there are other institutions doing their share of the killing, but I don't know exactly. It's difficult enough to piece together what's going on here right under my nose. If it ever came out that I've told you, we'd both be put straight into one of these new concentration camps. You know, where the government locks up and maltreats all its political opponents, along with anyone else it doesn't like, for the purposes of re-education. Richard's belly knotted and ached. He found himself thinking about Alfred Scher's terrible end. But you have to know what your classifications mean for the sick, Harms went on. Herbert was one of the first to be gassed. They told him the lorry was going to the cows, and that's why he got on so willingly. Later on, all the corpses were burned, and the relatives sent a bit of ash. The only opportunity I had to hint at something here not being right was the death certificate. We were instructed to think up some plausible causes of death, and were supposed to vary the dates of death so that nobody would wonder why all the Hamburg patients had died on the same day. For Herbert, I wrote burst appendix. He had no appendix, said Richard. His voice was dull. He felt dazed, as though moving in a thick fog, and everything Harms was telling him sounded like cheap horror fiction. Herbert. Of all the patients in the secure unit, Richard had been the most fond of Herbert. He had sincerely wished him a future life worth living, but all he'd done was send him to his death. No, he told himself, before the guilt could overwhelm him. I didn't send him to his death. I was duped like Herbert was. The guilt lies with those who organized this. That's precisely why I chose this as a cause of death. Richard realized Dr. Harms was still talking to him. Ask his next of kin, Dr. Helmer. Ask if they've received an urn showing his date of death as April 4th, 1940, and a message of sympathy saying that he died of a burst appendix. Then you'll know I'm telling you the truth. Richard tried to swallow. The full implication of what Dr. Harms was telling him had not yet sunk in. Can I phone you if I still have questions? He asked, unable to think of anything else. Yes, I'm working here until May 15th, but after that I'll be at the front. Dr. Harms gave him his telephone number. And we need to see how we can spread this information to as many hospitals as possible without being exposed ourselves. As I said, this is all taking place in extreme secrecy, and the kind of deliberate error that I have built in will be weeded out. But the world has to know about this. There is mass murder going on here in front of our very eyes, of the weakest and the most helpless. But why are other doctors going along with it? Asked Richard. Why aren't they doing what you're doing? Do you think for 1 minute Kruger would do what I'm doing? And there are hundreds of Krugers in white coats. With these words, Harms hung up. The registration form he had last been working on caught Richard's eye. 80% productivity. He'd embellished it to that level. He screwed up the form and completed a fresh one. This time he gave the patient the rating of a healthy individual. And that's precisely what he would do from now on. Kruger didn't check the forms in any case, and Berlin was a long way away. After all, a bit of impudence had got him through that earlier business with the Gestapo. Chapter 34. The phone call from Dr. Harms had thrown Richard into far greater confusion than he'd cared to admit. The story was monstrous, absurd, and hardly credible. On the other hand, its treachery made it a perfect fit with the system. First the sterilizations, then the reduction in rations, finally culminating in extermination by carbon monoxide poisoning. Ordinary people had to resort to the black market for their petrol coupons or stop driving altogether, but in Brandenburg a vehicle dispatched you to your death. And that was probably not the only place. That evening he told Paula what had happened. Her initial reaction was similar to his, one of disbelief, just like her father, who went so far as to suggest that Harms was simply crazed. Yet when Richard phoned Herbert's parents to extend his condolences on the loss of their son at Brandenburg, they confirmed what Harms had told him. Herbert's father was furious at the cause of death being described as a burst appendix, as Herbert had had his appendix removed as a child. For a moment, Richard wondered whether he should tell him the truth, but he shied away from that. Even his father-in-law hadn't wanted to believe it, and in any case, what were Herbert's elderly parents supposed to do about it? So he simply said something about how there must have been a mix-up, and maybe they should ask the hospital exactly why their son had died, and left it at that. He told Fritz about it, and his friend was as incredulous as the others. "This can't be right," he said over and over. "This is barbaric. What on earth are they doing this for?" "It's purely economic. The sick who are unfit for work are seen as a drain on the state. Even sterilization's more expensive than killing them. But if this is what's happening, we must make it public." "Yes, but it's happening by stealth, really secretly, precisely because it is unimaginable. Do you know what'll happen if we make this public? They'll simply declare us insane, lock us up, and then treat us to a trip in the mobile gas chamber or make us disappear like they did with Alfred Scher." Fritz was pale, struggling to find words. "That means there are murderers in our government." Richard nodded. "What are you going to do, Richard?" "I have no scruples about putting false information on the forms. From now on, all my patients are going to be as capable of work as the healthy." "And what if that gets out?" "I'll take the risk, particularly as it's so small. Kruger has no interest in my expert statements, and the forms are sent off to Berlin, along with forms for all the German asylums and clinics for nervous diseases. How on earth are they going to check up on individual cases from Hamburg?" Richard kept his word. Henceforth, every one of his patients was recorded as being in a position to carry out work of economic value. He also tried to discharge new additions as swiftly as possible, so that they weren't even registered in the first place. On top of that, he'd asked his father to take on Manfred and Rolf, 21-year-old Down syndrome twins, as helpers in the family business, and to give them accommodation in the workshop itself. This was because, in a later telephone conversation with Dr. Harms, he had discovered that identical twins, regardless of their productivity certification, were not immediately gassed, but sent off elsewhere for alleged scientific experiments to take place. Manfred and Rolf couldn't do the full range of jobs, but they could at least sweep up the workshop, run errands, and look after the guard dogs. They were both always cheerful and made huge efforts to do everything well. At first, Richard's mother had been uneasy and was worried it could be dangerous taking in asylum residents, but once she got to know them and learned more about the background to Richard's desire to help, she even managed to persuade Margit to let them have Jürgen's old room. "I can't understand why their own parents are not doing all this for them," commented Margit later. "How can they take the risk of these terrible things happening to their sons? They might be feeble-minded, but they're likable enough and know how to work if you give them the right things to do." "I agree with you, Margit, but that's why I asked Papa to take them on. Their mother died when they were born, and their father put them in residential care very early on, but they're only allowed to stay there until they're 21. That's how they came to the asylum, but I saw straight away that they wouldn't be safe there for long." "They'll be safe with us," promised Margit. "I've spoken to Holger. We could take on another one like these two if it helps to save a life." "Really? I do know someone." And that's how Johannes Mörnecke, the schizophrenic who had been buried alive during the previous war, and had consistently favorable reports from Richard, also got a position at the Helmer Joinery Workshop and so vanished from the files at Longenhorn. Come the end of April, every member of the population received a gas mask. They came in all sizes, even for infants. Emilia and Georg were intrigued and tried them on, complaining about the strong smell of rubber. "There now, that's why car tires are rationed. They need the rubber for the gas masks," said Richard dryly. "Do you really think the British will launch gas grenades at us?" asked Paula, for once disconcerted. "Yes, and cluster bombs, fire bombs, no expense spared. That's if our flak guns don't shoot them down first," commented Richard. "Haven't you seen the towers for the anti-aircraft guns being put up all over the place?" "I have, actually," said Paula. "And this morning someone came here from the local authority wanting to check our cellar for its suitability as an air raid shelter. They're going to put in a couple of extra beams over the next few days and want us to clear out our stuff to make space for bunk beds. Have we got much stuff down there? The old pram, both the cradles and the changing chest, and then the tinned food. I'll phone my father and ask him to have his staff clear the cellar there. Could be they'll know someone with a use for the cradles and the changing chest. Paula sighed. I hope we're never in the position of having to use this cellar, and definitely not with these gas masks. A fortnight later, deafening sirens woke Richard in the middle of the night. He looked at the clock. Just past midnight. Paula was already awake, sitting bolt upright in bed. Air raid warning, Paula. Get the children ready. Paula was out of bed and dressed in a trice. Richard was ready quickly, too, and hurried to the children's bedroom, where he simply got Emilia and Georg into their dressing gowns and gathered up their clothes. Papa, are they going to throw bombs at us now? Asked Emilia. They'll try, but the flak guns will shoot them down first. You've nothing to worry about. And why are we going down to the cellar? Just in case someone drops a bomb before the flak man can shoot it down. It's just to make sure. Anyway, you've been wanting to try out those beds for ages. That's right, said Emilia. Then she signed to her brother. You're lucky you can't hear the noise of the sirens. It really hurts my ears. Paula came in with a suitcase. Let's put the children's clothes in here. There's still space. As she held out the open case, Richard saw that all their photo albums were already safe-packed, together with birth certificates, professional certificates, and reports. We can replace clothes and furniture any time, said Paula, but I don't want to be running around trying to replace papers like these. Well done, said Richard proudly. Maybe we should just leave everything in there from now on, ready for the off. They made haste down to the cellar and, on the staircase, bumped into their neighbors, some in nightclothes, others fully dressed, also on their way to the shelter. Oh, dear Lord, are they going to blow this house to pieces? Wailed old Frau Walter. Don't worry, Frau Walter, piped up Emilia. Our flak men will shoot the bombers down first. Isn't that right, Papa? Yes, our anti-aircraft rockets will get there first, confirmed Richard. This is just a precautionary measure. Emilia and Georg had always wanted to have the top bunks, but once they were actually in the darkness of the cellar, lit only by a few paraffin lamps, Emilia asked her father if she could stay close to him in the bottom bunk, and Georg asked to be with his mother. Of course, Poppet, said Richard to his daughter, smiling a little to himself that she was wanting to take refuge with him, while Georg had opted for his mother. Sigmund Freud would have definitely put all this down to an Oedipus complex. In the distance, they heard the sinister low-level hum of aircraft, interrupted by the flak rockets, and now and again individual strikes. At the moment, it all sounded a long way off. Right, it's not directly overhead, confirmed Richard, while Emilia snuggled closer into him. Go to sleep, little one. I'll keep a lookout and make sure that nothing happens. I'm not at all tired, she said. We could look at some old photos, suggested Paula brightly, taking one of the albums out of the suitcase. So she and Georg sat on Richard and Emilia's bunk, and the lamp seemed brighter. Shall we look at the photos of Italy? As she spoke, she put everything into sign language for Georg. Georg nodded, and Emilia said, "Oh, yes, I'd like to see the ones of the Colosseum and hear those stories about the Christians getting thrown to the lions." So you want scary stories, do you? Asked Richard with a smile. Yes. All right then, but we must tell the stories really quietly so as not to disturb other people. To any observer, they presented an unusual scene, a family of 4 conversing through signs and gestures, the only sounds a laugh or a whimper. Richard was relieved to see how concentrating on the stories helped Emilia to forget about the disturbing background noise of bombs and flak fire, while Georg had, for the first time in his life, a distinct advantage in not hearing anything. The all-clear sounded around 3 in the morning, and all residents went back to their flats. That wasn't so bad, announced Emilia as they went back upstairs. Our flak man was really careful. You're right there, said Richard. He was. Next morning, however, he heard that overnight the British had dropped over 400 incendiaries and 80 high explosives on Altona, St. Pauli, the port, and on Harburg. Houses and barns had gone up in flames. 34 people had died and 72 were injured. This was May 18, 1940, and Richard realized this war could not be compared with the earlier one. He feared it would be far worse. And yet, by contrast with the previous war, the German army remained on the advance. Paris fell in June 1940, and everyone celebrated. Adolf Hitler was now seen as the greatest military leader of all time, and there was talk of a blitzkrieg. The disgrace of Versailles had been wiped out. Karl sent a postcard from Paris and a photo which showed him up the Eiffel Tower with his comrades, all of them in uniform. His smile came across as genuine, and Richard felt relieved that his nephew seemed to have conquered those feelings of guilt. He hoped Karl would soon be home, but nobody, and nothing for that matter, was any safer in Hamburg. There were new concerns about enemy attacks against civilians. And so it was that early in July a British fighter aircraft came out of the clouds without warning and dropped 4 high explosives directly on Stahlsuperstrasse, where children were at play. 11 children, 4 women and 2 men were killed. The newspapers condemned this as a cowardly act of aggression, and Fritz told Richard how he'd tended to 2 of the victims on his operating table. A 7-year-old had slipped away as he treated her, and he'd managed to save a boy of 11, although both his legs had been blown off in the attack. What kind of people are these, bombing children? Fritz raged after the event. Yes, okay, we're at war, but why can't they just bomb the port, the wharf, and places like that, not just come in from nowhere and hit kids out playing with their friends? It's barbaric. It's abnormal. I know, said Richard. It's worse for the children in any case. Not just that they can't sleep undisturbed at night, but there are even daytime raids now. Paolo worries every time Georg goes to and from school on the tram. He let out a huge sigh. How are Henrietta and Harry with the nights in the air raid shelter? Relatively good, to be honest. Rudy's more scared than anyone, really. He creeps into a corner with his tail between his legs and whimpers fit to break our hearts. Henrietta and Harry stroke him and calm him, and that helps them both forget to be frightened. And of course I always tell them our flak rockets will shoot down all the bombers before they get anywhere near our house. Richard gave him a look of sympathy. You know, if Hitler was clever, he'd negotiate a peace treaty now that he's taken Paris. Then he could go down in history as some great military leader, and we'd get a decent night's sleep at last. Unfortunately, great military leaders are so full of themselves that they go on until they fall off their mighty pedestals. Just look at Julius Caesar and Napoleon, said Fritz. Yes, said Richard quietly. I fear this is only the beginning. Chapter 35 February 1941 Humans are creatures of habit, as Richard liked to say, and by now it had become routine to seek safety in the air raid shelter at least twice a week. Losses were still being contained, and at least no one had had to use their gas mask yet. People adapted. On every staircase and in pretty much every flat, there was now a bucket of sand or a pail of water to put out the incendiaries. If the air raid warning had lasted more than 3 hours overnight, then the children had leave to go to school 2 hours later than normal. Repair squads proved dependable. Even a hit on a power station would be put right in under 2 hours. The war had changed Hamburg. No white pleasure boats steamed across the Alster now, as a timber structure had been put in place across the water to mislead enemy aircraft and remove any point of orientation. Fritz frequently brought horrific tales from the operating theater, where he would be in the middle of surgery when the sirens went and have no option but to carry on with the operation throughout the raid. The majority of patients in Hamburg's hospitals could not in any case be taken down to the air raid shelters due to lack of facilities. Their only hope was that the anti-aircraft rockets would do their work while they lay helpless in their beds. The asylum at Langenhorn, however, remained relatively safe as it was too far out to be of any interest to enemy bombers. So life there went on in its usual way until one morning in February 1941 when Richard got a call from Fritz. I've got bad news, said his friend. I'll start with the less dangerous part. The black market trader I've been getting all your petrol coupons from has been rumbled. Shit, muttered Richard. I hope he hasn't got a customer list. That'll drop us both in it. Don't worry, there's nothing to implicate us, but that's not the only thing. I can't even go on giving you my own coupons because I've got to sell the car. My call-up papers came this morning. What? Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. My call-up papers. Fritz practically had to spell it out for him. But you're the senior consultant and Professor Wehmeyer's deputy. They can't just conscript you like that. Yes, they can. and it's to serve as director of a medical battalion for the German Africa Corps in Tripoli. My research into operating on bullet wounds to the skull and on multiple abdominal traumata, the work I published with Professor Wehmeyer, is what's led to this disaster. The top brass must have thought, oh well, the prof's too old for the front, we'll leave him in Hamburg, so my hard-won skills are sending me off to serve the fatherland alongside its other battling sons. His laugh was bitter. And there was I, idiotically believing that if I did the best work possible, that I'd be indispensable to the home front and not get conscripted. When are you reporting for duty? On March 1st, as if all I'd been waiting for was to sacrifice myself for the Führer, the people, and the fatherland. Fritz, I'm truly sorry. Maybe you made the better decision going for psychiatry, but surgery's my whole life now. Shall we have a beer together this evening, while you're still here in town? You bet. Then I can bellyache to you in person about it all. Fritz chuckled quietly in spite of the somber mood. Moments after Richard had put the phone down, there was a knock at the door. It was Kruger's secretary, Frau Handelow. Dr. Helmer, Dr. Kruger wishes to speak to you immediately. Your telephone line has been engaged, so he asked me to come and fetch you. What's wrong? A supervisory commission from Berlin is here, and there are a few queries about your statements. What kind of supervisory commission? Asked Richard, getting to his feet and preparing to follow Frau Handelow. From Tiergartenstrasse in Berlin, the place we send all the statements to. Tiergartenstrasse. The place where life and death decisions were made on the basis of those patient registration forms. Richard's face burned. Was this a routine visit, or had they noticed that for the last 9 months every single patient at Langenhorn had demonstrated the same productivity as a healthy person? If they looked at the forms carefully, they'd have seen straight away that everything had been embellished. Would it be a case of insubordination or incompetence, and what would happen to him now? He followed Frau Handelow down the corridor, his mind rapidly working through ways in which he could outmaneuver them, if what he suspected was true, but nothing seemed appropriate. He couldn't play the staunch but stupid Nazi as he had before, because Kruger was going to be there too, and Kruger had had it in for him for a long time now. Whichever way you looked at it, if they examined his statements alongside the original files, he'd had it. Dr. Kruger's impatience was evident as soon as Richard entered his office. With him were 2 men in civilian clothes, files open in front of them on the desk. Ah, here at last, he snapped. These gentlemen are from Berlin and have questions to ask. Good morning, said Richard. How can I be of assistance to you gentlemen? Good morning. Although they both returned his greeting, they didn't do the usual Heil Hitler. Was that a good sign? Richard wasn't sure. I'm Dr. Niesen, said one, acting as spokesman for the pair of them, and this is my colleague, Dr. Klausner. The Ministry for the Interior has asked us to come here and look into your patient's files. You've come all the way from Berlin to look into our patient's files? What have we done to deserve this honor? Asked Richard. Kruger threw him a scathing look. It has come to our attention that the efficacy of treatment here is well above the average. For 9 months now, every one of your patients has received a productivity assessment comparable to the average healthy worker. This has sparked our curiosity. I see. Richard's throat tightened. He tried to conceal his disquiet. Our colleague Dr. Kruger has told us that you are responsible for the registration and classification of all inmates. That's right. Richard folded his hands behind his back so that nobody could see them shaking. It is remarkable that most of your classifications do not seem to match with the files themselves, Dr. Niesen went on. We have sampled 11 at random, and in 9 of these, the productivity assessment is falsely positive. What do you have to say? Richard tried to clear his throat. I've filled out so many registration forms that it's perfectly possible that 1 or 2 errors have crept in. 1 or 2 errors? Dr. Niesen studied him with raised eyebrows. In this sampling, your error rate is more than 80%. That would suggest an error in your methodology, don't you think? Richard remained silent. You have nothing to say? Richard's mind was feverishly working on how to get around this. The truth would send him straight to prison. I was expected to determine precise percentages regarding patients' capacity for productivity in comparison with that of a healthy man. In the end, I'm a doctor, not a farmer, If you look at agriculture, you'll understand that work of economic value is in fact being done. Work that contributes to nourishing the patients here and indeed those in other institutions, particularly those with children's wards. And this is why you certified every single mentally ill patient here with 100% capacity, in spite of the fact that this applies to only 20% of the patients at the very most. I see the work and the contribution that the sick make when performing tasks for the hospital. I have no figures to draw a comparison with the typical average agricultural worker. From the outset, it has been incumbent on the expert witness to define the terms of the capacity for productivity. I have completed the forms to the best of my knowledge and conscience. But you ought to have recognized the variable quality of your patient's work and taken the trouble to show some gradation, Neeson said, flaring up at him. Any idiot could have done that. Excuse me, I'm a doctor, not an idiot. Richard let this slip almost involuntarily. Is that so? Snarled Neeson. It looks as though it's the other way around with you. Then he turned to Dr. Kruger. It seems to me we have here either a case of crass stupidity or of calculated insubordination. I'm afraid I have to assume the insubordination, said Kruger. Dr. Helmer has been an outstandingly reliable provider of expert statements for some time. I would not otherwise have given him this responsibility. Richard was seized by an idea so bold it was almost reckless. He now had nothing to lose. Kruger had already stabbed him in the back. It was time to take Kruger into the abyss along with him. So I'm your sacrificial pawn, although you yourself informed me that those of our patients on the first wave of registration forms were gassed in Brandenburg, and because of this you asked me to fill out all future forms differently in order to save the others from this same fate? Kruger stared at him, aghast, and bellowed, That's an out-and-out lie. Gentlemen, said Richard, addressing the two visitors, if you look carefully at the files, you will see that my incorrect entries started 9 months ago, and that all those prior to that were correct. I had orders from Dr. Kruger to carry on. I'd have kept that to myself if my colleague had at least shown the decency not to charge me with insubordination over something that he himself ordered. Helmer, you are summarily dismissed, roared Kruger. This is grotesque. He turned to look at the two visiting doctors. Gentlemen, I deny all knowledge of this monstrous impertinence. Neeson nodded. It's not for us to be thinking about disciplinary measures here. Dr. Kruger, if you are minded to start a procedure for insubordination, you are at liberty to do so, of course. I would, however, advise against it because a procedure of this type would merely draw unnecessary attention to the deed. I think that the dismissal of the guilty party on the grounds of gross misconduct and the reworking of the registration forms would be the most elegant solution to the problem. Do we understand one another? Then he turned to Richard. As for you, Dr. Helmer, in such times as these, it would be a waste for a doctor like you, someone who pays so much attention to his patient's capacity for productivity, to stand in court for insubordination. To my mind, you will be of far greater service to our people at the front. I shall today inform the conscription office of your immediate availability, and you can get on your knees to thank God that I am in such a lenient mood. That is all. You may go. Richard was stunned, which made him slow to take in what had just happened. Not only had he been dismissed from his post and would now be conscripted, but his patients would all now be reassessed. He felt some relief that he had already removed the twins, Manfred and Rolf, as well as Johannes Mörneke from Kruger's sphere of influence. But was that any compensation? Had he been too arrogant when he'd thrown caution to the winds and basically declared every patient as fit for work? Would it have been better to sacrifice a few in order to save the lives of others? Without a word, he left Kruger's office and went to gather up his belongings. While he was still packing things away, there was a knock on his door. It was Kurt Hansen. Is it true what I've heard? You've been summarily dismissed. Yes. But why? Because I've behaved like a doctor and not an idiot. Take care of yourself, Kurt, and look after our patients. They desperately need you even more than ever. And that is how it came to be not Fritz, but Richard who needed to pour his heart out over a beer that evening. That's dreadful, said Fritz. Looks like I did choose the right specialism after all. Certainly the way things are, yes. Richard took a large mouthful of beer. Paula had been horrified when he'd told her what had happened. Losing his job was one thing, but to have conscription looming, well, that was quite another. What if they put you in a punishment battalion? She'd asked him, her face and voice full of worry. Richard had just shrugged his shoulders. He'd run fresh out of ideas to get him out of this. But Fritz had a brainwave. Head them off before the marching orders even arrive, he said. Sign up of your own volition for the medical battalion that I've been assigned to. I'll write out a formal recommendation saying that I need you there. We'll do it first thing in the morning, before that idiot in Berlin has time to act. That means you'll already be committed, out of sight and out of mind. And on top of that, they won't be afraid of their mercy-killing scheme coming to light because you'll be tucked away in North Africa. And we can go through it shoulder to shoulder like we always have. Do you know what? That doesn't sound so bad. Richard turned to the barman. 2 more beers here, please. Exactly, said Fritz. Shoulder to shoulder. I'll ask Professor Wehmeyer for a statement in support as well, saying that you can be deployed as both a surgeon and psychiatrist at the front, and that makes you of significant importance in the war effort. I'm sure there'd be no further questions asked. Except by Kruger, perhaps. I've already caused him a fair bit of trouble. I'm afraid he'll never forgive me. Are you dependent on the forgiveness of an idiot who stabbed you in the back and sacked you? No, absolutely not. The barman brought over their beers. To life, said Fritz, and may we always find a way, even in the darkest of times, of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. To life, repeated Richard. They clinked glasses, and, in spite of all his concerns, Richard felt some comfort. He was not alone. Chapter 36. Paula tried to make Richard's last few days in Hamburg as pleasant as she could and not let her worry affect him. But he knew her too well not to sense her inner anguish at the prospect of this separation. You won't have any money worries, he reminded her. The army may not pay so well as the hospital, but it's better than dole money any day. Don't you dare tell me you won't need clothing ration cards anymore and that we have to look on the bright side. She was watching him try on his uniform in front of the bedroom mirror, and although she'd rather never have seen him in uniform in the first place, she had to admit he looked tremendous. The gray jacket with its silver-blue lapels and epaulets bearing the classic symbol of his profession, the golden staff of Asclepius, was so dignified and showed off his handsome physique. The elegant peaked cap and highly polished black boots completed the picture of a well-turned-out officer. Thanks to Fritz's intervention and outstanding references from Professor Wehmeyer, Richard had immediately been assigned to a junior doctor post rather than an auxiliary role, and this gave him the rank of lieutenant. I'll only be in the medical service, he said, hoping to lessen Paula's fears. We carry a weapon purely for self-defense. I know that. Have you got a photograph for your ID card? No, they need one in uniform. I was thinking we could all go to the photographer tomorrow and have a couple of family portraits done at the same time. Family photos with you in uniform? Paula frowned. Not that I'm superstitious, but it hasn't exactly brought your family any joy to have a farewell photo of someone in uniform, has it? We've got to break the bad spell sometime, said Richard airily. Nothing'll happen to me anyway. Fritz thinks we'll be in the main military hospital in Tripoli, and that's miles from the front line. It's probably much quieter than Hamburg in an air raid. He paused. I'm far more worried about leaving you alone with the children at such a terrible time. We'll manage. What matters is that you watch out for yourself and come back to us safely. I don't ever want a letter like the one Margit and Holger received. As a matter of principle, I have no intention whatsoever of dying for the sake of the Führer, the people, and the fatherland, I promise you. I'd far rather survive as a coward than die as a hero. He drew her close. You'll never be a coward, Richard, she said, sinking into the comfort of his embrace. If you were a coward, you'd have joined the party long ago and outdone even the likes of Kruger in bootlicking for self-advancement. But you've always stayed true to yourself and tried to do the best for your patients. You're the bravest man I know. The doorbell rang. That'll be Amelia, said Paula, breaking away from Richard and going to open their front door. Shortly afterwards, Amelia came rushing into the bedroom, her school satchel still on her back. "Daddy, I've brought you something," she shouted boisterously as she took off the satchel. "Really? What can it be?" "Ooh, is that your uniform? You look really smart, Papa." Paula came back in, just in time to see Richard smiling broadly at his daughter's compliments and enthusiasm. "Thank you, Poppet. And what have you brought me?" She undid her satchel and took out a pot of greasy cream. "This, look, because it's much hotter in Africa than here and you mustn't get sunburn." Laughing with delight, he took the pot and then wrapped his arms around his little daughter. "Thank you so much, darling. You're just wonderful. You think of everything. What on earth would I do without you? Are you staying in Africa long?" "I don't know yet. And will you fight against the English when you're there and stop them dropping these bombs on our heads?" "No, I won't be fighting anyone. I'll be working in a hospital with Uncle Fritz, treating our sick and wounded soldiers." "Can I try on your new cap, Papa?" "Of course, darling." He took it off and handed it to her. She put it on and looked at herself in the mirror. The peak almost covered her eyes, and with her long fair plaits hanging around her shoulders, it made for a comical contrast. "Suits you perfectly," said Richard, whereupon Amelia tried to salute him. "Pity I won't get a cap like that when I join the League of German Girls next year." The sirens started. "Air raid," exclaimed Paula, "and Georg isn't back yet, but the tram's due any minute." "Get yourself and Amelia down to the cellar straight away. I'm off to the tram stop for Georg." He grabbed back his cap and put it on. Leaving the house in uniform still felt alien to him, but there was no time to change. While Paula and Amelia hurried down to the cellar with the suitcase full of their precious photo albums and documents, Richard ran to the tram stop. The few people still out were moving fast toward their own shelters, and most people were already somewhere safe. Richard found himself wondering what the tram driver would most likely do. Would he wait at the next stop so that everyone could find somewhere to take cover, or simply carry on with his schedule? Fritz would definitely still be in the operating theater, ignoring the threat from overhead in order to finish the operation. In the distance, he saw the tram coming and heaved a sigh of relief. When it stopped, most of the passengers got out fast and rushed away. Georg was confused and had to look twice before recognizing his father in uniform. "Quick, air raid warning." Richard signed to Georg. The little boy nodded and ran straight up to him. Richard seized him by the hand and they set off for home. Almost immediately, Richard heard the roar of enemy bombers. He paused and looked skyward. This was the first time he'd been outside in an air raid. Georg followed his gaze. The bombers were still very high, probably aiming for the port area. Soon afterwards, he heard anti-aircraft rockets, and they saw an aircraft going into a spin, coming down and exploding on the far side of the Elbe. Richard flinched, but at the same time was so fascinated by what they were witnessing that he forgot to keep running. Georg, spared the horrific background noises, was spellbound. The lad stared fixedly up at the sky and pointed towards a tiny white blotch that seemed slowly to float down to earth. "That's the pilot," Richard signed for Georg. He jumped out just in time with his parachute. "As soon as he lands, our people will capture him and he'll be a prisoner of war until it's over." Several more planes tumbled from the sky, and the flashes continued for a while before the enemy turned back, and the sirens sounded the all-clear. Georg was still transfixed by the sight of columns of smoke now rising from the port. "We've been lucky again, haven't we?" said Richard to his son. Georg nodded, beaming from ear to ear. "Weren't you frightened?" "No," signed Georg in reply, "because I was with you, Papa." And Richard's spirits fell. He'd have given anything not to be forced to leave Paula and the children alone with all this. Next morning, it was time for the photography session to secure Richard's ID photo, as well as some family shots. While the photographer was busying himself in the back room with the final photos, the bell at the shop door announced the arrival of a new customer. It was none other than Fritz, also in uniform, along with his family and Rudy, the adorable dachshund. "I had a feeling we'd see you all here," he said, as Rudy, tail wagging, ran straight over to Georg and Amelia. "So even a captain in the medical corps needs an ID photo in full regalia, eh?" commented Richard with a smile. "He certainly does," confirmed Fritz. "But while we're all here, shall we have one of us all together? We haven't got any like that." That's true. Richard was ready to agree, but at the same time, he couldn't help thinking of Paula's superstition. Did it really bring bad luck to photograph the family group with one in uniform, ready to leave for the front? He'd always refused to believe it, but suddenly it didn't seem so absurd. This time, though, there was one big difference, he told himself. His brother, Georg, as well as Jürgen and Karl, had been called up as ordinary soldiers. He and Fritz were medical officers. They wouldn't be fighting, and yes, he'd love a photo of all of them together. As he was always the photographer, he was usually missing from the many photos they had of Fritz and his family, and Paula with the twins. 4-year-old Harry picked Rudy up, then they lined up in 2 rows, both sets of parents at the back, the 4 children with the dog in front. "We'll need 4 prints, please," said Fritz, "one for each of us to have with us at the front, and one for each family to have at home." The photographer nodded, pleased to have such good business. "May I make a 5th print for my window display? Family photos with an officer in uniform are so popular." Fritz and Richard glanced at one another briefly and read each other's thoughts. "No, I'm afraid not," replied Fritz. "It's very much a private matter." "That's a shame," said the photographer. "But you're welcome to photograph our doxy and put him in the window," said Fritz with his most mischievous laugh. "He's very photogenic." In response, the photographer merely handed Richard his collection number and got on with the ID picture for Fritz. Chapter 37. Once Richard had departed for Tripoli with Fritz on March 1, 1941, the gap in Paula's life was hard to bear. She had to stop herself from writing him a long letter even on the first day. The worst time was when the children were at school. Of course, Richard had always been out at the hospital at that time of day, but she knew he'd be back in the evening and that he and the children would fill the flat with life. She had the mornings to herself for housework and making sure that everything was done, but since the air raids had intensified, she found herself constantly worrying if the children were not at home. As a distraction, she and Fritz's wife spoke often on the telephone. Dorothea felt the same, and there came a point when both women confessed to missing their jobs. "It wasn't a problem when Fritz was here," Dorothea explained. "He used to talk about operations so much that I felt as if I was still working there and knew what all my old colleagues were up to. Now I feel twice as cut off. I take care of the housework and the children, but that isn't enough." Paula sighed. "Same here. Maybe we could make ourselves useful somewhere for a couple of hours a week. You know, just on a voluntary basis," Dorothea suggested. "Then nothing at home would be neglected, but we could still do something meaningful outside the 4 walls." "Good idea," said Paula enthusiastically. "Any ideas where?" "I'll ask around." Dorothea's doorbell rang and Rudy started barking. "There's Henrietta. I'll have to go. I'll get in touch once I've found out more." "Thank you so much. Bye, Doro." One bright spot on the horizon at least. The second bright spot came only 1 hour later when the post arrived. Here was the first longed-for letter from Richard. In spite of the privilege of the Army Postal Service, it had still taken 10 days to reach her. "My darling Paula," it started, and her heart beat faster. They might have been married for over 12 years, but whenever he called her that, she felt like a love-struck teenager. "We arrived in Tripoli safely. The railway journey to Italy passed without incident, and, being medical officers, we were lucky and had our own compartment. In Brindisi, we boarded the ship to Tripoli. It was unfortunate that we got there in the dark, so I had no opportunity to take photographs. The sea was rough and lots of people were seasick. Fritz and I escaped unscathed, but we decided to spend all the time below deck once we realized that being out in the open meant the risk of slipping over on the vomit left by those who didn't quite make it to the railing in time. Tripoli's a wonderful city, a blend of Middle Eastern charm, the culture of ancient Rome, and Italian flair. Did you know that a third of Tripoli's inhabitants are Italian? You could almost think yourself in Europe. In the 1920s, the Italians built a beautiful cathedral, the Santa Maria degli Angeli. I'm enclosing a photo so you can get an idea of how Italian it is here. You'd hardly think there was a war on. Just as Fritz promised, we're in the main military hospital, and our job is to take in all the field hospital patients and either get them fit for further duty or send them back home for full convalescence. The main military hospital is very well equipped. We've got 2 operating theaters, an X-ray department, dentistry, and a pharmacy. Fritz has officially allocated me to surgical work because there's no psychiatric ward, but every unit has 3 mad nurses, and our 3 are something special. There's Walter, the highest ranking. When he found out I'd originally been a psychiatrist, he commented that no decent German uses foreign words, and that the word for me is mad doctor. I countered this by saying that the only person who'd say mad doctor is someone who doesn't know how to pronounce psychiatrist, and that this is a diagnostic tool for measuring a colleague's intelligence. Walter looked at me in some irritation while the other 2, Bert and Wolfgang, burst out laughing and said they would show me around. To my surprise, Walter joined in the laughter and gave me a knowing slap on the back. Since then, he hasn't once referred to a mad doctor in my presence and enjoys the joke of no longer referring to his own profession as mad nursing, but as psychiatric nursing. He's really gone up in my estimation now. Walter is also a rarity when it comes to getting anything organized. He's one of those people who can get hold of the most extraordinary things. So, for example, he knows a cobbler who can make you bespoke shoes without coupons and at a good price. Fritz and I are going to pay him a visit. After all, we have to take whatever opportunities come our way. If it turns out that he can make ladies' and children's shoes without doing an actual fitting, I'll tell you next time I write what measurements he'd need, and then on my first home leave, although I have no idea when that might be yet, I'll bring you all new shoes. And do tell Amelia from me that I haven't needed the cream yet, because here in March it hardly gets above 20 degrees. Besides, we're in the military hospital all day, and because there's more surgical work here than psychiatric, I'm often indoors with Fritz in his theater. It's lucky that he more than makes up for my lack of experience in the field, so sometimes I hold the clamp to assist him, and so far, nobody's realized that the last time I operated was as long ago as 1929. There are a lot of cases of diarrhea, so the most I prescribe at the moment is charcoal tablets. I'm pleased to say that Fritz and I have escaped all that so far. Fritz thinks it's because Walter provides us with beer every evening, and this cleanses the gut. Whether that's medically correct, well, I very much doubt it. I think it's far more to do with the fact that we only ever use boiled water. Still, it's a good excuse for a beer. When we sit on the terrace outside the military hospital in the evening, both of us enjoying a beer as we watch the sun set behind the palms, you could almost believe we were on holiday. Tell the children I love them and give them big hugs from me. With all my love, Richard. Paula's heart ached as she read the letter, all the more so when she'd studied his pin-sharp black-and-white image of the cathedral against the city backdrop. She remembered vividly how he'd spent a couple of years deliberating over whether he should indulge in the expensive Leica 3, which professionals used, or whether he should choose the cheaper, earlier model. Once he'd forced himself into a decision, he'd been like a little boy with his new camera. Nothing escaped his viewfinder. His first home leave would see him turning up with not just a bag bursting with new shoes, but also 3 new photo albums boasting everything worth seeing in Tripoli. This was some consolation to her, as it meant she could share something of his experience. She read the letter several times over before setting it down and writing an equally long and affectionate letter in return. Even though she didn't have anything special to relate other than little anecdotes about her everyday life with the children. But that was exactly what he longed to hear about, and she was only too happy to recount as much as she could. Then she stowed his letter away safely in the suitcase with their family albums and documents. From now on, that would be as important a memory as every single photo in the albums. A couple of days later, Dorothea got back in touch. I found a way of us doing some voluntary work without it coming under people's welfare. She said this first and foremost, as she knew how low an opinion Paula had of that organization ever since it became a purely National Socialist setup. At Finkenau, there are now even more lone first-time mothers because their husbands are fighting at the front. Not all of them want a mother's help from the NSV. Sister Matilda suggested putting us in touch with these women, and we could then help them if they need support with newborns or have questions. Paula was pleased. She still had warm memories of the young mothers she had worked with at the women's hospital when she had been doing her PhD thesis. When can we start? We could go to Finkenau tomorrow, if you like, to introduce ourselves to 2 young mothers and their babies. Let's do that. I'm really looking forward to it. I'll leave Hari and Rudy with my mother, and then we won't be restricted. By the way, I've had a letter from Fritz at last. And what does it say? He's working on a new approach to amputation. It'll decrease the safe distance from healthy tissue so that, in certain cases, he won't have to amputate as high on the thigh, but lower down at the knee joint. He even sent me all sorts of detailed drawings and descriptions of the dermatoplasty he'll use to create a weight-bearing stump for a new prosthetic limb. Dorothea laughed. That's Fritz all over. His work is his life, and he likes being married to an old theater nurse who understands what he's on about. And I must admit I'd rather be taken seriously like that than have him write me soppy love letters. We're so lucky with our two, aren't we? They see us as equal partners they can share everything with, said Paolo with warmth. I know. That's why I miss Fritz so much. Chapter 38. You people really are something else. Richard didn't know whether to be pleased or embarrassed. The medic's common room had been decorated with a huge banner proclaiming, Africa, July 23, 1941, Dr. Helmer's 40th birthday. Various bits of furniture had been pushed together to create one long banqueting table on which stood a magnificent cake, the number 40 beautifully marked out in frosting. Walter was the first to congratulate Richard. Many happy returns, Doctor, sir. Other colleagues came over to do the same, but Fritz was nowhere to be seen. This surprised Richard, as he was sure that Fritz was behind everything. Just as he was wondering where his friend could be, the man himself appeared, together with the two musicians from their regiment, Phaeton and Max, both of whom also worked as hospital porters. Fritz had also brought Richard's camera from the room they shared. Many happy returns, Richard, my dear chap, Fritz said, shaking him by the hand. You didn't really think we'd let your 40th birthday pass unnoticed, did you? Especially as you're spending it so far from home. I hoped you would, to be honest. Richard looked awkward. Never! And now time for the birthday boy's serenade. Phaeton, Max, ready? We need everyone to join in. As the two musicians struck up the well-known melody of Happy Birthday, and 11 male voices chimed in, some less tuneful than others, everyone felt the emotion of the occasion. After the choral offering, Fritz got the men organized for a souvenir photo. Now everyone stand behind the long table, please, and hold up the banner, Birthday Boy in the middle. The folks back home will want a picture, won't they? You've got to be in it too, Fritz. Okay, but who's going to take the picture? My camera has a self-timer, Richard explained. All we need is something steady and at the right height for it to stand on. We can manage that, said Walter. Let's use one of the little tables and put a chair on top of it. Although this reduced the impressive length of the banqueting table, it meant the camera was at the right height and in exactly the right spot. Richard set the self-timer, then dashed to his position in the middle, between Walter and Fritz, and in front of the banner they were all holding up. Then they cut the cake. Delicious, said Richard. Who made it? Our mess sergeant's a mate of mine, explained Walter with a grin. We all put aside a bit of flour from our own rations, too. Richard was touched. He knew the current supply situation was tight. People didn't speak of it, but everyone had difficulty getting enough food at the moment, which was why, to try to secure deliveries from Italy, the chief of staff had planned a major offensive to capture Tobruk and its large harbor. Any news from home? Asked Fritz. Nothing. The army post seems to be as slow as our supply ships at the moment. Not to worry, there's still time today. Maybe there'll be a convoy this afternoon, and I've already lined up something you'll like for this evening. Really? What's that, then? A touch of the Middle East in an Italian colony in Africa, Fritz said with a grin. Bring your camera, it'll be worth it. That was all he would tell him. When the little party ended early in the afternoon, there were still 3 operations scheduled. The advantage of working in the main military hospital was that the life-saving emergency work always had to be done out in the field units near the front line, which meant that the patients arrived at the main hospital in a stable condition, so surgery was always done to a timetable. Infected wounds continued to cause problems, however, and often made amputation inevitable. Working in conjunction with a consultant in general medicine, Dr. Buchwald, Fritz tried to combat this through early intervention with antibiotics, first using sulfonamides to fight the infection and only then carrying out any surgery, so as to minimize the necessity for amputation. Sadly, many of the men arrived in such a weakened state that the infection could not be contained even with the use of antibiotics. 2 out of today's 3 cases had ended in amputation. "I've heard that the British have a new antibiotic called penicillin," said Fritz as he carefully stitched the skin flap over the stump of his patient's amputation at the knee. "Trouble is, it's very expensive and hard to make. There was a really interesting lecture about it at that last conference I went to in London in '37. If they've found a way of producing it in quantity by now, they'll have a huge advantage over us when it comes to dealing with the wounded." "So why aren't our chemists working on it?" asked Richard. "Dr. Buchwald reckons it's best to rely on our mass production of sulfonamides because penicillin hasn't really proved itself yet, and producing it on an industrial scale isn't possible at this stage, so it wouldn't really contribute much to the war effort at the moment." Fritz let out a sigh of regret. "Do you know what I hate most about this war? Apart from the obvious stuff like the death and destruction, it's not being able to exchange ideas with colleagues in other countries for the benefit of all our patients. You know I'd like to see the Royal Air Force shot out of the sky, but the few times I was in London for work, I met such good people and we always had really productive discussions." Darkness had fallen by the time they left the operating theater, and Fritz decided this was the right moment for the surprise. "I've got leave of absence for us both till 7 in the morning, he told Richard. "Get spruced up and bring your camera." They headed for a bar with more than a hint of Middle Eastern and Italian influences, where the main draw was belly dancers in their exotic and revealing costumes. Guests sat at tables or lounged on couches, enjoying the traditional hookah. "Shall we try a pipe?" suggested Fritz. Richard wasn't keen. He'd never had a taste either for cigars or cigarettes, whereas Fritz enjoyed the occasional cigar. "I'll just watch, I think," said Richard after a bit of hesitation. "Then you can tell me if I'm missing anything. Then your job is to get a couple of nice photos of the dancers. I'll take care of all the tips." Fritz certainly hadn't exaggerated the delights of live belly dancing. They'd only ever seen anything like this in moving pictures, so to experience it now with authentic local music and 2 professional dancers was something very different. The girls' costumes were a mass of sequins and reminded Richard of the new 2-piece swimsuits that had become fashionable of late. Paula had got herself one during the summer just before the start of the war. She'd gone for emerald green, and with her bare midriff and long blonde hair falling loose, had looked for all the world like a mysterious sea goddess in Richard's eyes. One of the girls wiggled her way over to the 2 friends on their couches and gave them quite a close-up of her swaying hips, while other men cheered on in the background. But Richard treated this as all just part of the show and didn't consider that the dancer was doing this especially for his benefit. She realized she wasn't having quite the desired effect on Richard, so turned to Fritz, who reacted in the same way as his friend and seemed to prefer another drag on the hookah. Richard detected a look of disappointment on her face as she moved away. The lighting hadn't been good enough for any photography during the dancing, so when the girls came over at the end for a bit more attention and the usual tip, they were surprised to find that Richard still wanted nothing more than a few pictures. He noticed how their stage smiles turned into genuine laughter as he asked them to adopt a few dance poses for him to photograph, something they were more than happy to do. When Richard explained in a mixture of German and Latin, the latter due to its closeness to Italian, that he wanted to show the pictures back home to his wife and children, the women looked so puzzled that Fritz couldn't help but laugh. "I suppose most men wouldn't even tell their families they'd been anywhere like this," remarked Fritz. "What about you?" asked Richard. "Me? I'd just like a couple of prints to show Doro and the children. I'm a decent family man, like you, my friend." They lingered for a while in the bar and watched the next act, a turbaned man juggling with flaming torches. While Richard stuck to his usual beer, Fritz was already on his 3rd pipe of the evening. "And how was the hookah?" Richard asked him as they made their way back to their quarters long after midnight. "I feel pretty sick, to be honest. That stuff's really gone to my head." "You can't go wrong with a good German beer," Richard said with a grin. "Shall I fetch you a sick bowl?" "Don't you dare, it's not that bad." The following day, the long-awaited supply convoy rolled in, bringing post as well as the urgently needed food supplies. There was a parcel for Richard. In it was a new, beautifully framed photograph of Paula and the twins, and a copy of Stefan Zweig's biography of Marie Antoinette, covered in a deliberately inconspicuous dust jacket. As he unwrapped the book, he broke into a broad smile. Paula had always loved buying him Stefan Zweig because she knew how much he admired the man's writing. He wondered how on earth she'd got hold of a copy. Since the Nazis had outlawed Zweig and publicly burned his books, it hadn't been possible to find them anywhere. She had probably found it at her favorite antiquarian bookshop, where the owner would keep special books under the counter for particular customers. A wave of love and affection flooded him with warmth. Not only had his wife sent him something good to read, she'd also chosen a symbol of rebellion against the dictatorship under which they lived. As well as the gifts, there were letters from his children, and a very long one from Paula. My dearest Richard, not a day goes by without us missing you, although the children are very brave and don't want to let it show. Your birthday will be especially hard for us, and we hope that our good wishes arrive in time. Summer has truly come, and even though it's not as hot here as it must be for you in Africa, we're enjoying warm weather that makes me long for those spontaneous trips we used to make to the Baltic coast. Yes, I know I could go there alone with the children, but I thought it better to store the car at your father's place in the garage. With the constant air raids, I wouldn't feel easy driving out to the seaside resorts. So instead of that, we're spending the summer at Moorfleet at your parents' allotment. The children love it here and can splash around in that little tributary of the Elbe. Georg is thrilled because his friend Horst is out here too, spending the summer at his grandmother's. The two are inseparable, and Emilia felt a bit shut out at first, mostly because the boys love the Winnetou books by Karl May and play at Cowboys and Indians the whole time. Horst likes to be the cowboy Old Shatterhand, and Georg is his native friend Winnetou. Horst thinks that's the right way round because Winnetou is silent, and Old Shatterhand does all the talking. Emilia didn't want to be in Shochi because she dies. Fortunately, your father loves reading Karl May and came up with the perfect solution. He suggested to Emilia that she should be Kolma Pushi from the old Shorehand books, the woman who lives and fights like a man. Horst and Georg couldn't argue with that. It looks as though the original adventures will need a rewrite, as the boys are now both enthralled to their leader, Kolma Pushi. Alongside all these light-hearted things, there is one that's really serious, Richard. A health worker from the NSV turned up here at the allotments and inquired where she would find Georg. She asked the other children whether he was simply hard of hearing or completely deaf, and knew he went to the deaf and dumb school. Luckily, the first child she spoke to happened to be Horst, and she didn't know how much he hates it when someone he doesn't know asks him questions, so he told her that Georg understands him perfectly well when they talk together, and when she asked Horst if he understood Georg equally well, he said, "Well, I can understand you, can't I? What a funny question."
This is the end of disc number 6. Please insert disc number 7.